Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mon Ami, for getting this meeting rolling. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Many thanks for joining us today. This is really a significant moment, to my mind, in the early infancy of the Global Compact on migration. We are trailblazing. This is the first meeting of the first regional review, the first formal element in the follow-up and review components of the Global Compact. To my mind, this commitment to follow-up and review of the Compact is one of its most significant achievements coming out of Marrakesh. It provides us with a platform to ensure that the document is not simply a collection of aspirations, but is a collection of commitments that can be built on and progressively realized. And so I am extremely grateful to be part of this meeting today, which over the course of today and into the end of this week, when the intergovernmental session meets, hopefully we'll be able to review progress on the implementation of the GCM in the strange geographical configuration that comes within the UN ECE. We'll be able to plan the way forward in shaping the global review. Of course, this is the primary purpose of the regional reviews, to help shape and better inform the global review that will take place in 2022. And it is also an opportunity, one opportunity amongst many, but an important one, to ensure that we adhere to our commitment for the broadest possible participation of all stakeholders, not just governments, but the whole range and panoply of stakeholders mentioned in the GCM, whose inputs and support are vital for the health and longevity of this framework. I very much hope that this meeting and the meetings on Thursday and the meeting on Thursday and Friday are not seen as static processes. I think to really come alive, the regional reviews must be part of a dynamic engagement in constantly looking at and trying to further the implementation of the Global Compact. There is always going to be a tension with a document such as this, which seeks to be comprehensive and which has no end point by definition, and which was born in a complicated environment between, on the one hand, the desire to see short-term immediate benefits from this way of working, whilst on the other bedding it down for the longer term. I think these tensions needn't necessarily be seen as tensions, but actually as reinforcing strengths. And I think the regional reviews can help with this if we don't just stop on Friday afternoon when the intergovernmental session comes to an end. I hope submissions keep coming in, and many thanks to those of you who found the time during this complicated period we're all operating in to send through your submissions in support of this week. I would encourage you to continue sending them through, to build off the submissions. I think we all need to review and study them carefully and to think through how we can use the next 18 months, 2 years before the global review to create a really enriched, active environment for discussing the Global Compact's implementation in this region and moving forward. My final words really are that no discussion on really any issue of international concern these days, and migration as much, if not more so than many, is complete without a reference to COVID-19. This will inevitably be a backdrop to our conversations today and those on Thursday and Friday, highlighting both how the Compact is vital as a framework, and I think we are seeing the emergence of a number of extremely positive practices that can be built on, that can be shared, that can be drawn from by other actors, and why the Compact must be strengthened in its implementation, given the very serious consequences that the pandemic is having for migrants the world over, including in this region. I'll leave it there. I hope today's meeting is an engaging one. Don't leave anything unsaid. And I look forward to bringing through Michelle the findings of these conversations into the meetings on Thursday and Friday. And with that, I'll hand over to Michelle and look forward to listening in during the day's deliberations. Michelle.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you for this wonderful intro to set the scene, in a sense. So my name is Michelle Lavoie. I'm the rapporteur for today. My organization is the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, PICUM. And I wanted to thank, first of all, Jonathan, Mon Ami, your teams, and the UN Migration Network for organizing this multi-stakeholder consultation. As you've said, Jonathan, this is the first of the regional reviews. We most likely will see the regional reviews in Latin America and the MENA, the Middle East and North Africa region. I think before the end of 2020, and then I could be getting my dates wrong, but probably at the beginning of 2021, Africa and Asia. And then we hope to have these regional reviews most likely completed by March of next year. And as Jonathan has mentioned, it's really a chance for us in the different regions to see how the GCM is being implemented in the regions, how we actually take stock of these developments. And I think it's also an opportunity to see where governments have introduced new legislation on the national or even regional level. And how does this new legislation that's been introduced since the Global Compact was adopted in December 2018, how does it fare with the Global Compact? I'll come to that in a little bit, but I think this is also a chance for us in the different regions to look at this a little bit more in depth. I wanted to, in this opening, just give 5 reflections. I wouldn't say takeaways, because I think you say takeaways at the end of an event. So I would say maybe 5 reflections for our consultation. And the first one is on the scope of the UNISA region. If you look on the UNISA website, I had to do this to be reminded myself, who is actually concerned by this region? So it says it's the countries of Europe, it's North America, although for timing reasons, most likely the colleagues in North America will take place in perhaps the Latin America consultation, which will come in a couple months, and also Central Asia. And this is the first point that I actually wanted to make, is that as civil society, in the past 14 years, since we've been coming together at the high-level dialogues that the UN has organized on migration and development, at the annual global fora on migration and development, and all the 3 different phases of the Global Compact on migration, the consultations, the stock taking, the first phase where we were kind of gathering information. Civil society has been meeting, and other stakeholders as well, in all of this time. But for various reasons, we have never had a huge amount of participation from colleagues, civil society organizations, and other actors who are based in the Central Asia region and Russia. And so it's really important that today this consultation also includes these actors, and that the facilitation of their participation is made possible also through interpretation in Russian. So we'd like to very much acknowledge our gratefulness to the UN Migration Network Secretariat, to the OSCE ODIHR, to the Solidarity Center Network, and other networks who are enabling this participation. There are millions of migrants in the Central Asian region, and without having input about what's going on, we miss this on the global level. So we're very grateful that today will be an opportunity to do this, and we look forward to the input on the panels and from the floor. The second point is, why do we need a multi-stakeholder consultation? Isn't it enough to just have, as Jonathan mentioned, the 2 government days at the end of this week? Well, I think, first of all, having this multi-stakeholder consultation builds on this precedent in the UN system, where different stakeholders who are other than national level governments can intervene. We had this precedent in 2006 and 2013 with the high-level dialogues on migration and development, where we had multi-stakeholder consultations. But what's also interesting, and Jonathan mentioned this in his opening, is that many governments and other stakeholders have made submissions to this consultation this week. And these are visible on the Migration Network website. And if you look at the two groupings of these submissions, this is why we need this consultation. It's not because these submissions are giving completely different stories. It's just that they complement each other. So there have been many governments who have submitted reports so far. We're very grateful to see them, and we also hope that there will be more coming up. But sometimes in the governmental reports, certain groups of migrants are mentioned or not mentioned at all. One of them in particular would be undocumented migrants. Sometimes in some of the stakeholder reports, we see solutions that are coming from civil society organizations, such as Alternatives to Detention, as one example. So it's important that we see some of these examples being developed. Sometimes there's a specific analysis of particular groups of migrants. So this was maybe not possible in some of the government submissions, but you see this in the multi-stakeholder submissions. This is the case with two submissions that look exclusively at the situation of migrant children. And I think we'll hear more, at least in the first panel, about one of those submissions and hopefully the other one later in the day. Some of the multi-stakeholder submissions also look more in depth at particular objectives. One submission looks particularly at the arbitrary use of detention in at least 5 countries in the UNISA region. So it's really important to have this diversity of views and to have a space for different stakeholders to actually put forward these views, and that's the purpose of today. The third point, and this is linked to the last point, is that it's not only about national level implementation. That sounds a bit strange because the GCM is actually geared towards countries adopting it and then incorporating it into their national level legislation and policies. And even though the GCM is indeed focused on the national level, there are 2 other levels of government that are equally important across the globe, but also for this region. And the first one I would like to highlight is the city and regional level government. There are 3 submissions on that website from the mayor's mechanism. So it's really important that this new entity is playing a key role in showing in the 3 reports that it has submitted. And I hope that some others will also take the floor in the panels and the discussions today. In these 3 reports, they've shown in those 3 cities the pledges that the cities made in 2019 after the Global Compact was implemented and how they as cities thought that they could be implementing it. So these are really well done key reports that we need to look at and take stock of in these discussions. And also recall that at the end of the day, the city level is where a lot of the action, in a sense, is taking place because the city level and the regional governmental level at the local level are where migrants are coming for basic needs. So this is really about integration at the end of the day. And the second level of government that's also very crucial for this region in particular is the regional, so the upper level regional. And this here I'm referring to the European Union. In 2020, this has been a key year for the European Union because we have a new European Parliament. We also have a new European Commission. And this year, the European Commission has been launching strategies for the coming years, 5 years of its mandate or further. So for example, we had the Victims of Crime strategy and the gender strategy that were launched in May and in June this year. Those would be relevant for Objective 7 on vulnerabilities in migration. The Victims of Crime strategy actually foresees that having irregular migration status makes an individual vulnerable when they have experienced crime. And so this new EU strategy looks actually to exchange information about good practices, also at the city level concerning that. In early 2021, the EU will launch the Child Rights Strategy and the Anti-Trafficking in Human Beings Strategy. These will be particularly relevant for Objective 10 on preventing trafficking in human being. In May this year, the EU launched the Farm to Fork strategy. This is relevant for Objective 6 on the fair and ethical recruitment and decent work. And so while this strategy recognizes the importance of social protection, working and housing conditions for agricultural workers, it does lack specific actions in the draft action plan to realize these goals. So it's one that we're looking at that maybe hasn't realized its true potential yet, also concerning migrant workers. But why do we also think this EU level matters so much? If we consider that 18 out of the 27 EU member states have adopted the GCM, the EU level is particularly relevant, especially for at least 2/3 of the EU member states that have adopted the GCM. Some EU member states' countries, governments collapsed because of the GCM. And this is actually noted in one of the submissions that they have taken note of this and also how they've been catching up in the meantime. The EU also negotiated actively during the GCM, and the EU External Action Service also made a submission today on the website. But the point that I also wanted to make is that in addition to all those other strategies that the EU has either launched this year or will launch early next year, it also in September launched the new Migration and Asylum Pact, which has nearly 10 legislative proposals that are currently now being negotiated by the European Parliament and the Council. Once these proposals might be adopted, they would be regulations for the EU 27. And why is it important to mention this? Because we feel that a number of these proposals run counter to the Global Compact on Migration in several objectives. In Objective 3, providing information at all stages of migration. Objective 8, saving lives and establishing coordinated international efforts at missing migrants, including the commitment to counter smuggling measures in full respect for human rights. Objective 10, on preventing trafficking in human beings. Objective 13, using detention only as a matter of last resort. And Objective 21 on return, readmission, and reintegration. In some other areas, the new Pact on Asylum and Migration doesn't yet offer many proposals. They're still being developed. So these ones we're still somewhat hopeful for. Objective 5 on pathways for regular migration. Objective 6 on social inclusion. There'll be a new strategy on integration and social inclusion that the European Commission is now developing and hopes to launch at the beginning of next year. And on eliminating all forms of discrimination and promoting evidence-based policies. That's Objective 17 of the Global Compact. The EU has a new action plan against racism from September 2020, and we hope that this will be linked to hopefully the new migration policies. So in any case, just to say that we can't overlook the EU regional level in this region in particular. The fourth point that I want to mention, and Jonathan has already said this in his opening, is the COVID-19 situation. I think we all realize, those of us who are hooked to the news, watching it several times a day, that Europe is one of the worst continents that's been touched by COVID-19. And what we've seen on the ground concerning migrants and social inclusion overall is that existing vulnerabilities that we've seen in society have only become worse with COVID-19. And so when we look at migrant workers, we see that many migrant workers lost their jobs when the lockdown started. That made them go into extreme destitution. Within PICUM's network, we had organizations that were specialized on particular issues, labor exploitation or gender, etc. And these organizations were asked to give food to undocumented migrants because they could no longer eat because they no longer had work. Many city-level organizations also found the same thing. Migrant workers, if they didn't lose their jobs, they were considered essential workers and they still had to continue, but many without safety precautions. Migrant workers in the region have suffered from discrimination and xenophobia and being blamed for the pandemic. But at the same time, we have, and Jonathan mentioned this as well, we have seen a number of positive measures. We've seen numerous EU member states release migrants from immigration detention during the first set of lockdowns, which was roughly between March to May of this year. We've seen a number of member states extend residence permits and suspend forced deportations. We've seen regularization. Portugal and Italy are two key ones that should be noted. And we've seen also a number of social protection measures. Countries that allowed undocumented, for example, to get access to healthcare. Ireland set up a firewall for this. So this is really clearly relevant for Objective 15 of the Global Compact. But what we've also seen, once again, are city-level responses to COVID-19. The CMIS, the City Initiative on Irregular Migration, is coming up with a report soon that has detailed and documented more than 15 or so cities throughout the region that have been providing food, have been providing support, sometimes even cash assistance through civil society organizations to help migrants who were ineligible for a lot of the governmental support that was being provided for citizens throughout COVID-19, but migrants, especially if they were undocumented, many times were excluded from that. So it's also, maybe just to conclude on this point, useful to know that a lot of these very practical examples of the COVID-19 responses have been included in the various guidances that the UN Migration Network is producing in the various thematic working groups. For example, Working Group 2.2 has guidance for UN member states on how to implement the Global Compact with a very useful annex. And a lot of these examples of the COVID-19 responses are included in that. And the final point that I wanted to make here is today's multi-stakeholder consultation is an opportunity for obviously many of us different stakeholders who are not national level governments to share our input, our experiences, and the realities on the ground. We would definitely welcome at today's event the views of migrants, migrant organizations who maybe found it too difficult to actually pull together that submission and put it together in a language for the website. There are very useful contributions that can be coming from different levels of different stakeholders. And we have interpretation in several languages today to make this possible. So we very much hope that the discussion will really be a true multi-stakeholder consultation and that we hear the voices from many different people. We look forward to listening today, and I'll hand it now over to Christian Wolf, who will be chairing the first session. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle and Jonathan, for the overview. Before, Christian, you lead us off into the first roundtable, just wanted to make a reminder to remind participants that the full stakeholder session will be recorded and also posted online after the session. Please go ahead, Christian.
Yes, thank you so much, Nami, and welcome to everyone, and really thank you very much for your engagement today. I know we do have a couple of people on the call who got up very early to be with us. We have others who are staying awake and will be having longer work days. So thank you very much for that. Thanks also to Jonathan for the introduction, and to Michelle for kind of setting the scene for us. We're very fortunate indeed to have her as a rapporteur today, because as you know, the outcomes of our discussions will feed into the formal review and will form part of the outcome document for this process. Just very briefly, and sort of in keeping with the well-worn motto of the last will be first, you might remember from the negotiations for the Global Compact on migration that many countries in the region that we're reviewing this week sort of struggled with giving their final thumbs up to the document for a variety of reasons that we don't need to go into right now. But perhaps in a bit of an ironic twist, we are now this is now the first region to be reviewed on a regional level. You know, it's been a bit challenging for some of the reasons that Michelle mentioned, also because we've had relatively little time. By we, I mean the totality of stakeholders who've been involved in this process, governments included, to prepare submissions. And so, what you've already seen on the website in terms of submissions that have been made are really have taken quite a different and varied approach to reviewing process on GCM implementation. I don't want to repeat all the remarks Michelle made about why it's important to have this multi-stakeholder consultation. It's just suffice it to say that, of course, quite a large number of countries in the ECE region see themselves or are perceived to be countries of destination, and also have, throughout, I would say, a relatively highly developed level of social policies, looking for equality of everyone on their territory. And so I think we do have a particular responsibility for this review, not just because it's the first review, but also because of the high standards that have been set in the understanding of states themselves of how they provide for the human rights and equality of everyone, migrants included. And so I think it would be very important for us to keep an eye on that as we go through the contributions today. We have, as I've mentioned, we've seen quite a bit of varied reporting so far on implementation. And we do hope that we see a nice and sort of very broad and varied type and style of contributions from our speakers and from all of you today. So I just wanted to remind you that we will have a panel with 4 speakers, and we then will go to the floor. We've received expressions of interest to take the floor from several of you. However, we will also be able to accommodate additional requests for intervention. So I just would like to encourage all of you, as you listen to the contributions, and especially, if you haven't registered your interest yet, do keep in mind you can indicate your request to speak, and we would encourage that, especially perhaps from those of you who are not customarily participating, so that we can make sure that we do get a broad range of stakeholder inputs into this process. So thank you again for being with us today, and let me move now to introduce our first panelist, our first speaker this morning, which is Dr. Pablo Rojas Cupari. He is the Migration and Freedom of Movement Advisor at the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. He has previously worked as a Senior Policy and Research Officer at the Migrants' Rights Center in Ireland, focusing on irregular migration and trafficking for forced labor, as well as a Third Secretary in the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He's also been doing research on migration policy, labor market precarity, having been an advisor to the director of the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency, and he's been the chair of the expert group on labor rights for the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, PICUM. So with that, Pablo, please go ahead and share your first observations of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, and apologies for that very long bio, but thanks so much for introducing me. I'm very happy to be here with everyone today. It's really a culmination of a long year process, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at this panel today. So just to complement Christian's introduction, I just wanted to say that to introduce the OSCE as an organization. We are the office, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and in particularly, I work for the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. The OSCE is the largest security organization in the world, but we have a specific interpretation of security which has human rights at its core. And one of the important points to remember for this consultation today is that the OSCE actually shares 55 out of the 56 countries that constitute the UN European Commission. So we are particularly suited to be discussing this topic today. Maybe if I will focus, I'll start with my input on the role that particularly regional organizations have in in the coordination and implementation of the Global Compact on Migration. I mean, the European region has a multitude of regional organizations, so I'm not going to aim to speak on behalf of all of those, but maybe I will tell you a bit about the experience of ODIHR and the OSCE. The way that we see our role in the GCM implementation process, and I would have preferred and liked to say that this is what we've been doing, but this is more of an aspirational for the next round. And the way we see our role in the implementation of the Global Compact is threefold. The first one is in our mandate, we can provide direct assistance to member states of the OSCE region. And in that regard, we can, in the future, work together with national authorities to prepare the voluntary review and prepare and assist in the voluntary review process. A second role that in that regard, we can also facilitate peer learning between different OSCE participating states or member states of the European Commission of the UN. Another role that the OSCE ODIHR has is to create dialogue spaces between civil society organizations and national authorities, which I think it's a fundamental part of the review and implementation of the Global Compact, and as today's meeting is an example of. And the third way in which we can contribute to this is by building the capacity of civil society organizations to engage with the Global Compact on Migration. And I think Michelle already mentioned some points in her opening remarks. I think the capacity of organizations across this region are not equal. And the dissemination of information regarding the Global Compact is not equal. And I think we need to rely more on regional organizations to be able to sort of to create a homogeneous understanding of how the GCM can impact in there. And this brings me to my second point about which is about the importance of bringing along sub-regions within this very large geographical space. I'm very happy that Michelle already mentioned one of those sub-regions that I want to touch upon, which is Central Asia. But I think we should also not forget about the South Caucasus and the Western Balkans. Now, I'm very happy to see that among the list of voluntary reviews, all of these sub-regions are represented. And the reason why it's important is because migration dynamics, as Michelle has already pointed out, are increasingly changing in all of these sub-regions. We like the weight of the European Union sometimes tends to shift the focus in what is this big geographical space. But if anything that COVID has shown us is the impact that or the level of mobility that, for example, we see in the Central Asian region and the corridor between Central Asia and the Russian Federation. So I think it's important moving forward that the GCM focuses more on this specific region and brings them along, because there is a lot of things to learn. I mean, equally for the Western Balkans, but I'll move on not to dwell too many on those points. I wanted to touch upon some of the impacts that COVID has had in this region and how that the intersection with the GCM, but Michelle has already done much of that. But maybe if I want to just briefly re-emphasize some of the points that she has made, is that both COVID has presented opportunities and barriers. I mean, it remains to be seen whether one will outweigh the other or not, but particularly obviously what we have seen in some of those sub-regions that I mentioned is the impact that restrictions of mobility have had on remittances, and the impact that the restrictions of mobility has had on increased coercive migration forms, which run contrary to the spirit and the objectives of the GCM. But as Michelle has already mentioned, what we have seen in the OSCE region is an increased change in detention practices, particularly at least opening up conversations about increased use of alternatives to detention. And we have seen increase access to social protection for precarious migrants, in particular undocumented migrants. And Michelle already mentioned the example of Ireland, and I have to say, coming from Ireland, that the idea that undocumented migrants will have a firewall and an access to social protection on the same level as other citizens would have been unimaginable before COVID. So I think we as part of the GCM process, we need to be able to harness the learning of these processes and how we can continue after this pandemic will be in the past. And like Michelle mentioned already, the extension of residence permit and the opening up of labor migration channels, I think that's really important, because if one thing that the pandemic has shown is the precarity and vulnerability of migrant workers, particularly in high earning economies, but at the same time the need that societies have on them. And while that has been in a way coercive in a certain manner, it has also been recognizing, and there has been more channels being opened up. And my final point, and that will be very brief, I think, is that moving forward in discussions of how GCM objectives are implemented and reviewed, one thing that we can't forget is the creation of more regular pathways of migration. And in particular, I would like to emphasize here the role that regularizations play in facilitating the creation of these regular pathways. We, in the OSCE at the moment in ODIHR, we are currently carrying out a research piece on the use of regularization mechanism as a form of policy, as a policy measure. And it would be good to also see how these results can be included in the follow-ups, in the conversations of the implementation of the GCM at the European level. So I will leave it at that. Maybe if I just want to leave with one last recommendation, it is, I think that the onus is on ourselves as regional organizations to have greater coordination among ourselves, and to find ways to coordinate also with the UN Migration Network Secretariat on how we can jointly have work together towards a continuation in this implementation, and to have a more coordinated approach in order to maximize the opportunities that and the weight that our organizations bring into this discussion. So thank you very much for the time. I'm looking forward to the follow-up discussions later on.
Thank you very much, Pablo, and thank you for reminding us of the importance of the role of regional organizations. I think especially at a time where we're seeing that, you know, reporting that's happening is still very new, and it's always good to have a multilateral mechanism behind that, in addition to what the network is doing to socialize this at the regional level. And also thank you for re-emphasizing the importance of pathways. I think that's something that we've seen already in a lot of the submissions that have come in, as well, that really looking at and strengthening the provision of regular pathways is at the heart of ensuring a lot of the other fundamental rights that the compact is seeking to ensure for migrants. So, and we look forward to the research that's being undertaken by OSCE at the moment on that. So thank you very much for highlighting that. Before I introduce our next panelists, can I just briefly ask our remaining two panelists, Andrea and Boris, to also request the floor so that the organizers can add you to the panel, and it'll make it easier for us to progress. Thank you. Our next speaker will be Madeleine Carew. Madeleine is the policy officer at the International Catholic Migration Commission here in Geneva, which has been an active member of the Initiative for Child Rights in the Global Compacts since its formation in 2017. Prior to joining ICMC, Madeleine managed her own consultancy in cultural integration for migrants in Munich for about 3 years, where she directly assisted migrants and supported municipal authorities and local institutions serving them, including the Bavarian Department of Labor and Industry, Caritas, and private firms. She also has professional experience in conflict management and in teaching. Holds a master's degree from Duke University and Middlebury College. Mandolin, we're very much looking forward to hearing from you. Please go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Christian, and good morning to everyone. Delighted to be here. Thank you for asking me to be part of the panel and shine the light a little bit on child protection today. As you said, Christian, I'm representing the Initiative for Child Rights. And so I thought it might be useful to just give a thumbnail sketch of kind of who we are. So the Initiative for Child Rights in the Global Compacts is a multi-stakeholder partnership bringing together over 30 civil society, trade union, UN, and philanthropic organizations around a shared agenda, which is protection and care of children and making sure that children are really at the heart of child protection is at the heart or part of the global compacts. Now, just another point to flag here may be useful is that most of our observations today and in our submission refer specifically to EU policy, while acknowledging that the UNECE region is actually substantially larger than that. So knowing that EU policies do have and can have an influence beyond EU borders, but it's perhaps useful to just mention that. We will be focused. So again, we will be focusing our comments here on implementation in the particular subregion of Europe. So for the UNECE region, I'd like to focus on 4 key priorities for implementation of child protection in alignment with GCM objectives and with the EU Pact in mind in particular. And the EU Pact really has a potential to prioritize children in EU migration law and policy and practice, and address systematic weaknesses and areas to strengthen safeguards for children within the EU. So my presentation is going to follow the following format. So I'm going to present 4 key priorities. Under each priority is an issue and then a recommendation. All of these points can actually be found in our submission on the website, and we heartily invite you to take a look at that. So for the first key priority is the best interests of the child. Now, the EU Pact refers to the best interests of the child, but implementation means that EU states on a national level have to establish, even entrench, safeguards so that migration decisions affecting children are propelled first and foremost by what's in the child's best interest. And so here's the issue. Under asylum and border procedures, it seems to be set up is kind of binary, whereby basically you're returned if you're denied asylum. And our concern here is that if safeguards to non-refoulement, best interests of the child, protection of family and private life are not made explicit, there's a real risk of depriving people of being able to access other pathways for international protection or for regularization according to member states' national legislation. Here's our recommendation. Full implementation of best interests of the child, safeguards, and then also making language understandable to children and including social and child welfare services in decisions regarding them, especially durable solutions. Our next key priority is non-detention of children. Our concern here is that the pact might lead to more immigration detention of children and not less. And that's in contrast to the GCM Objective 13 and 13H, which recommend ensuring availability and accessibility of a range of alternatives to detention in non-custodial contexts, and to really, at the end of the day, work towards ending child detention in migration. Here's the issue that strikes us. It's in the pre-screening stage of irregular entry or even in search and rescue where children and families could be detained up to 10 days. And then the other thing that we're concerned about is that in some EU member states, detention could become the norm for the whole duration of the asylum and return border procedures, which may last up to 6 months or even 10 in cases of exceptional mass influx or risk of it. So you'll see in our, I could talk more about that, but I know we've got other panelists behind me. So in our submission, we mentioned a successful pilot project in Bulgaria, Cyprus, and Poland, where alternatives to immigrant detention were found and worked. And so we welcome you to zero in on that in the submission. Now, the second issue is that the pact proposes the age of 12. There's a cutoff of the age of 12 regarding border procedures, and apparently children aged 12 to 18 who are accompanied by their parents must undergo border procedures, and that could translate into detention and lack of access to regular pathways beyond asylum. Moreover, children under 12 could be subject to border procedures due to security concerns. And there, with the security concerns, that could raise questions about scope and meaning. It seems a little fuzzy there, and opening up to interpretation, which could again lead into risky waters. So here's our recommendation. Step 1, the exclusive use of alternatives to child detention, as well as more explicit reference to the obligation for all member states to prioritize alternatives to detention for all children under the age of 18. And I say 18 because that's the age, that's the cutoff for children in the CRC, the Convention of Rights for the Child, which I believe all EU member states, or at least a lot of them, have signed. And using that age of 18 for child status and making decisions on relating to them in terms of migration. The third priority is family reunification, and we welcome the developments that we've seen so far. For example, the EU Pact points to strengthening the right to family reunification. And again, I don't really have a lot of time to go into it here, but look at our submission, because we do see some we do welcome progress that's been made on that. And the second good thing is that the evidence requirements for family reunification under the Asylum and Migration Management Regulation are made more flexible. And that means that siblings and family members formed in transit could be considered in the definition of family. So that's good. Here's the challenge. The administrative barriers that come with administrative barriers such as costly procedures that are complicated to prove a family relation. We're talking about DNA testing. This is very expensive. Short deadlines and high income requirements are just a big barrier, which means that families and children struggle to access family reunification, which we know to be a key, safe, life-saving, regular pathway for them. Here's our recommendation. Increase access to family reunification by eliminating administrative barriers and obstacles. Implementing these would be practical ways to align with Objective 5 and 7 of the GCM, not only for facilitating regular and safe entry, but also reducing vulnerabilities. Because we know, for example, what these kids can do is be roped into a connection with traffickers and undergo unspeakable abuse. So really reinforcing family reunification, practically speaking, is a good step in the right direction. Now, the fourth one, I know I'm going a little fast here, but I hope you're all with me. The fourth one is on COVID and children. And certainly, Michelle and Christian, you brought this up, very, very important. And we've got two points on this. We're concerned that children are being left behind in education, and that families and children aren't getting the support that they need. And this is what we mean. So I want to mention a challenge here, and I want to also mention some progress. The challenge is that children have had their education interrupted, and we fear that some might not return. And this includes children who can't access remote learning possibilities. The second thing that we're seeing is a great uptick in violence, exploitation, and abuse against children, and of separation from their caregivers. at the same time as access to child protection and psychosocial services have decreased in many European countries. Now, the progress, and this is something that Michelle, you touched upon, thank you. We just want to echo that and say, listen, progress has been made. I think Italy and Portugal have put place in measures to temporarily regularize migrant stay, which has an impact on children because of they're in family context and they depend on their parents to live. And then also Ireland is granting safe access to healthcare. So, as well as other EU member states have released migrants from detention as alternatives to immigration detention have emerged. So we have seen some progress. But nonetheless, we still have a recommendation, and that is mental health and psychosocial, with the uptick of this violence and this exploitation and just the pressures that COVID are putting on children and their families, we say, look, mental health and psychosocial support and GBV services need to be strong and to include migrant children. Families and children should be able to access and benefit from COVID-19 response and recovery programs and measures without discrimination based on residence or migration status. And this includes facilitating enrollment in schools. We also, the last recommendation is to develop appropriate child and gender-sensitive long-term responses to the pandemic that addresses protection of children and families in migration and using the framework of the GCM. And we know the GCM is an excellent framework that really propels partnership and collaboration, which is what we need now more than ever, especially for the most vulnerable, being namely children. Thank you, among others. I think that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Nathalie, for sort of walking us through how some of these issues really break down at the specific level. We know, and we've heard from a lot of governments, including in this region, for a long time, how much emphasis they put on protecting the rights of the child, and the details really need to be looked into, and especially if, as we're seeing now, at sub-regional level, there are new instruments being developed, being discussed at a time where we're also looking at implementation of the GCM. I think it'd be very important to read those comments very closely and to look at how these new initiatives align with, or as you pointed out, in some cases can run counter to what states have committed to in the context of the GCM. So thank you very much for that, and also for pointing out some of the positive examples we've seen and where progress has been made in the last few months as we're moving towards the first review. Our next speaker is Andrea Kempf of the German Institute for Human Rights, who will be speaking on behalf of the European Network of National Human Rights Institutions. Andrea is a senior researcher and policy advisor at the Department of International Human Rights Policy at the German Institute for Human Rights, Germany's national human rights institution. A lawyer by education, she focuses on migration and linkages to development, accountability mechanisms, environmental and social standards, and the promotion of civil society. Alongside her work at the Institute, she also teaches a master's degree course on human rights and development at the University of Applied Sciences in Düsseldorf, and occasionally works as a consultant for both state and non-state organizations. Before joining the Institute, she spent several years working with EU-funded development projects, among others for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Andrea, please let us know your views on the progress of implementation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Christian, and thanks very much to the United Nations Migration Network Secretariat to organize this stakeholder consultation and to invite me. As Christian has said, I'm presenting today the work of the European Network of NHRIs. For those of you who aren't that familiar with national human rights institutions, and national human rights institutions are state-mandated bodies who are independent of government with a broad human rights mandate. And ENRI is the European network. It's a membership organization. It's comprised of all 41 national human rights institutions from the Council of Europe region. And with regard to migration and also asylum, this is a well-established working area for NHRIs, both at the national level as well as the European and global level. On the European level, European NHRIs work through a working group established with an ENRI on asylum and migration on a range of issues over the last years. Our written submission focuses on these areas of work of ENRI, which are linked or related to the following GCM objectives. Objective 11 on managing borders in an integrated, secure, and coordinated manner. On Objective 13 on migration detention, and Objective 15 on providing access to basic services for migrants. My oral input or oral statement today will focus on Objective 11 on border management, and particularly the EU's impact on the human rights of migrants, both inside and outside their borders, or the EU's borders. As mentioned by Michelle Levoy in her introduction, in September 2020, the European Commission has proposed a new set of asylum and migration policies, the Migration and Asylum Pact. This is and will be the subject of discussions over the next months, and is also likely to set the path for the EU's policy over the next decade. This pact includes proposals for faster asylum determination procedures at the borders, including through a pre-entry screening phase. It includes the widespread use of border procedures, the resort to immigration detention, and a stronger focus on speedy returns. Also, in the context of the EU's reform, the creation of new systems to monitor human rights at Europe's borders is being discussed. So in our work, we have found that countries in and outside the EU are both affected by the EU's asylum and migration policies, especially those on both sides of the EU's external borders. And we consider that the new proposed EU policies cannot be assessed and discussed without considering the current practice of asylum and migration management across Europe. So to remind each and every one of us, through Objective 11 of the GCM, the states have committed, inter alia, to implement border management policies that respect the rule of law, obligations under international law, and the human rights of all migrants, regardless of their migration status. And in achieving these objectives, states also agreed to cooperate with national human rights institutions and other relevant stakeholders. However, some of our findings in the 2 years since the adoption of the GCM are that human rights violations at the borders persist. NHRIs in Germany, Greece, Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina demonstrated in a joint report that the so-called increasing externalization of the European migration policy has profound impacts on human rights protection. Some of the findings of NHRI's work are, and they of course align with those of other actors, there are inadequate reception centers, lack of qualified staff, police violence against migrants, collective expulsions, pushbacks, refoulement, denial of access to justice and to basic services. And NHRIs have also raised concerns about the criminalization and or harassment of individuals or civil society organizations that work to protect migrants' rights, even those providing humanitarian assistance at the borders. Also, when it comes to their own work, in some European countries, NHRIs are being hampered by state authorities when working on migration and border issues. This has included, for instance, lack of follow-up on NHRI's recommendations, refusing access to official documents and data related to concerns about the violations of rights, and discrediting NHRI's work. So it's our NHRI's view that the reform of the EU asylum and migration policies cannot be discussed without these findings. And given the worrying human rights situations at the EU's borders, some of our key recommendations are, first of all, that the EU and its member state should not resort to an increased focus on border and expedited asylum procedures without sufficient guarantees for the respect for the right to asylum and access to justice and deprivation of liberty at borders. Second, the access to individual and fair asylum procedures is non-negotiable. Neither security reasons nor the call for a more effective migration control system justify violence, pushbacks, or collective expulsion, and the violation of the principle of non-refoulement. Third, reception conditions, including at borders, must comply with international human rights standards, specifically in COVID times. And reception centers should be open, and deprivation of liberty must remain a measure of the very last resort, particularly when it comes to detention at the borders as well as elsewhere on the territory of states. Children should never be detained, and states must pay specific attention to their needs and those of other groups in situations of vulnerability. Second, deprivation of liberty through other means than detention cannot be seen as an alternative to detention. Third, detention should be used only as a last resort, particularly it should not be used as a deterrent measure due to a risk of absconding. And last but not least, on monitoring and on the role of NHRIs, Europe needs more transparent, accountable and human rights compliant governance at its borders. However, the answer is not to create new mechanisms, but to strengthen existing ones. Transparent and independent monitoring at the borders, including by NHRIs, is an essential aspect to ensure human rights monitoring and accountability. So states must reinforce the work of human rights monitors, including by ensuring that they are adequately resourced. National authorities must respect their mandates so that they can carry out their work effectively, including by granting them access to data. And the EU should do all within its powers to support NHRIs and other monitors at borders who are being hampered in their work. So thanks again for the possibility to present the work, and I'm looking really very much forward to the other presentations and the discussions.
Thanks so much, Andrea, and thank you also for focusing on Objective 11, which, you know, from what I've seen so far is sometimes been a bit of a stepchild in terms of the objectives. It's not one of the ones that stand out in commentary, but it is indeed central from a human rights perspective. So thank you very much for giving us your organization's perspective on that. Before I invite our last panelist, could I please remind you all that we will be going into taking interventions from the floor afterwards. So if you're not already on the list and you would like to intervene, please do let us know in the chat so we can add you to the list. And may I also request the first person who will be speaking afterwards, Ms. Eleonora Testi from the UN Major Group on Children and Youth, to already request to speak so that we will have a more seamless transition and we won't waste time on the technicalities. Yeah, thank you very much. So with that said, let me introduce our next speaker, Mr. Boris Kravchenko. He's the president of the Confederation of Labor of Russia, the second largest nationwide trade union confederation in the Russian Federation. Confederation is comprised of more than 20 affiliated union organizations that collectively represent more than 2 million members in sectors such as manufacturing, food processing and services, hospitality, education, healthcare, aviation, seafaring, and others. Mr. Kravchenko has been actively involved in the union movement since 1989. He had his first leadership post as the secretary of the Independent Trade Union of Miners in Russia in the 90s and helped to coalesce independent union organizations into what became his current organization. He was then elected KTR General Secretary in 2010 and has been in a leadership position ever since, supporting the organization and its affiliates to protect the interests of all workers, including migrant workers in the Russian Federation. So Boris, please share your insights with us. Thank you.
Спасибо, Кристиан. Постараюсь.
Well, thank you, Christian. I will try to briefly outline our approaches and dwell on the recommendations. This is a view from the side of organized workers of the Russian Federation, one of the two, along with the Republic of Kazakhstan, largest destination countries for migration flows in the former USSR. In total, according to various estimates, there are about 10-12 million migrants in Russia. Most people who come to Russia to find work are citizens of Central Asian countries. Among them, there are temporary labor migrants, the so-called seasonal workers, people who have arrived for a longer period of time, and those who plan to obtain Russian citizenship and build their life in Russia in the longer run. Be that as it may, they all face complicated bureaucratic procedures, they pay income taxes and pay for their work permits. Considering that every 10th worker in Russia is a foreign labor migrant, the national trade union associations as organizations fighting for social and labor rights of workers closely monitor the situation of this category of workers. trade union surveys show that a huge number of migrant worker jobs in our region are in the informal sector. Surveys show that more than a third of such workers in the Russian Federation and about half of them in Kazakhstan work without formal employment contracts. About half of them experience delays in wages. Up to 80% lost their wages completely, and up to 40% of workers experienced signs of forced labor in the form of confiscation of their identification documents or a ban on leaving their workplace even outside working hours. Well, the pandemic, obviously, which began in February of last year, entailed a number of extraordinary events, such as the closure of international borders and enterprises of various sizes, the introduction of lockdowns, of course, and all this had a tremendous impact on all categories of citizens. It served as a particularly powerful trigger for the deterioration of already precarious position and situation of labor migrants in Russia. In early summer, one of our unions launched an online survey on the impact of the spread of coronavirus on migrant workers. The respondents were mainly citizens of Kyrgyzstan who have been working in Russia for many years, employed in trade, services, construction, and the hotel sector. Of these, 35% do not have any employment contract with their employer. Only 44% of the respondents had the possibility to continue working, but only 41% of them managed to maintain their usual level of wages in full. 80% of the respondents were placed by the employer on unpaid leave. 9% were dismissed along with their colleagues when their workplace shut down with the beginning of the lockdowns. There is no official information on the number of infected foreign citizens, as well as on the number of those who sought medical help in the public domain. This means significant difficulties in accessing assistance. A huge problem was the unwillingness of people to speak about their condition, caused by the fear of possible verification of documents, the threat of expulsion from the apartment by the landlord, and so on. The government of the Russian Federation made some efforts to extend visas and residence permits, which temporarily suspended possible deportations, but failed to provide any necessary level of social protection for migrant workers. Those who stayed live in increasingly cramped conditions to cut costs and often spend the night in workplaces where they're exposed to the virus. A similar situation is observed with labor migrants in Kazakhstan, where there are mass layoffs, which completely excludes migrants who have lost their jobs from the system of social assistance to those generally provided to those affected by the pandemic. What is particularly evident at the time of the pandemic, when the labor migration fell out of the main focus of attention and remained without proper regulation, is the emergence of institutional problems that have become even further aggravated in recent months. First of all, we're talking here about the difficult access to tools for protecting the rights of migrant workers, such as the opportunity to obtain qualified or to access qualified legal assistance, carry out full-fledged representation in court and administrative instances, including qualified translation. The opportunity to use decent temporary places of stay, including while awaiting trial. The opportunity to use consular support due to the difficulty of access to embassies and consulates. Lack of information and practical restrictions on the formation or accession of migrant workers to trade unions, as well as the exercise of their rights to collective action at work. Difficulty of access to medical services. Onerous registration of or legal status processes that encourage people to remain irregular. Ineffectiveness of the National Labor Inspectorate, unable to detect and correct violations in the workplace on time. Reproducible conditions for non-payment of full wages. Those factors aggravate all other problems and issues and limit the ability of employees to solve them independently, at least in part. One of the regulatory tools designed to resolve the noted institutional problems could be international agreements that make it possible to protect the rights of migrants by influencing national legislation and the national situation. As you know, the Global Compact contains a number of direct references to international framework documents. Specifically, a mention is made of the importance of fundamental labor standards in the field of migration enshrined in the conventions of the International Labour Organization. We believe that this standard should apply to migrant workers in all states that have supported the Global Compact on migration, regardless of whether the country has ratified the main ILO conventions in this area or seeks to do so. First of all, we believe that based on the standards of the ILO, the right to freedom of association and the right of migrant workers to form or join trade unions of their own choice should be ensured. We believe that the right to freedom from discrimination in the main destination countries of the region must be ensured. In these countries, legislation should provide for the rights of migrants in accordance with international human rights standards, including fair and safe working conditions, the right to good rest, the right to access jobs without discriminatory procedures for obtaining the right to work. We believe that host countries should provide regulatory and visa flexibility for migrants, especially during the pandemic. We believe that migrant workers should have access to social protection and decent health care, regardless of their status. We have a number of well-developed recommendations for national governments, large transnational and national companies that continue to be affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, reflected in particular in the Shadow Global Compact implementation report sent to partners by the Solidarity Center. At the same time, we insist on the importance of ratification and promotion in the countries of the region of the main conventions of the International Labour Organization governing the situation of migrant workers, above all ILO Convention number 97 on migrant workers and the ILO Convention 143 on abuses in the field of migration and on ensuring equal opportunity and treatment for migrant workers. We hope that the use of these two tools or instruments in the Global Compact will improve the situation. Thank you.
For highlighting these issues in Russia and in the region in general. I would also encourage participants to have a look at the submission that was made in this regard, which paints a very interesting picture of how the different rights violations are really linked between different sets of objectives, which is something that I hope we'll be able to encourage more as we do our reviews of the GCM going forward. I would now like to go to the floor and open the floor for interventions. Our first speaker will be Ms. Eleonora Testi of the UN Major Group on Children and Youth. Please go ahead and make your remarks. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm Eleonora Testi and I'm the EU Regional Focal Point for Migration at the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth. This year, we have conducted 2 series of consultation at the regional level and national level, focusing on the UK, Portugal, and Germany as countries, and we consulted with 21 youth-led and youth-focused organizations operating in Europe, representing over 4,600 young people, including migrants. We focused on the state of labor migration pathways and on GCM Objective 7 on addressing vulnerabilities, 15 on basic services, and 18 on skill development. We found that youth are at the forefront on GCM implementation in their countries and communities, and have outlined some key asks and priorities. I will now try to share a short summary of some of the results, while another member of our group will offer a more in-depth description of our findings in the next panel. Overall, youth are leading initiatives offering support and referral programs for vulnerable migrants and to help them access essential services such as health, social support, decent housing, and quality education. Moreover, young people are helping their peers finding skill building and job opportunities. A key obstacle, however, remains the fact that migrants' ability to access the required documentation is often difficult for their education, in order for the education qualification to be recognized. Given this finding, youth organizations call on governments and other actors to increase funding for migrants integration programs, including through supporting youth-led programs. We also urgently call on governments as well as educational institutions to ensure that no child, regardless of migratory status, is missing out on their education. And we call for help to create pathways for streamlining recognition of foreign qualification and certifications. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has made it very hard for everyone to focus on issues beside the health emergency, but the pandemic accelerated inequalities and negatively impacted migrants more than many other groups, making the GCM implementation more and not less urgent. And considering that 1 out of 3 migrants are youth, we ask to be included and taken into account. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eleonora. We will now have an intervention from Ms. Joanna Moore from the British Red Cross, who will be followed by Ms. Aina Shormanbayeva of the International Legal Initiative. So if I could ask Aina to already request the floor so we can go to you next. Joanna Moore, please go ahead with your intervention. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Joanna Moore from the British Red Cross. To give you a bit of background, so the British Red Cross is the largest independent provider of services to refugees and asylum seekers in the UK, and we're addressing the vulnerabilities of migrants in the current context of COVID-19. The British Red Cross also provides humanitarian assistance globally for migrants in their most vulnerable moments, adopting a route-based approach across borders. We coordinate closely with the Red Cross, Red Crescent national societies across Europe, for example, on family separation, reuniting migrant adults and children, and on anti-trafficking. On the Global Compact for Migration, British Red Cross has played an active role in the development of it. Now, 2 years since it was adopted, the true test in the implementation is whether it can make a difference on the ground in the lives of migrants and the communities that host them. At the heart of the compact is the idea that migration is a global issue requiring multilateral solutions. International cooperation is needed on migration and cross-border issues, as we've seen with COVID-19 and the impact of border closures. A few weeks ago, a family of asylum seekers from Iran attempted to cross the English Channel from France. Their boat sank and the family died, including 2 children. This tragic event brings to the fore the need for humanitarian solutions, with countries working together and beyond borders, and addressing the reasons why people flee their homes in their country of origin. We need to see good and humane asylum systems, including access to good quality legal advice for asylum claims and rights for families to be reunited. Before COVID-19, British Red Cross convened 3 roundtables to discuss the implementation of the Global Compact for Migration on the themes of prioritising vulnerabilities, detention as a last resort, access to essential services, and protection along migration routes. We make 5 key recommendations in a policy report called Policy into Practice, Implementing Humanitarian Priorities in the Global Compact for Migration. These recommendations are based on the roundtable discussions between the UK government, migrants themselves, civil society, and think tanks. Firstly, a solid foundation for the implementation requires appropriate planning at national and local levels, including a cross-government strategy for the GCM, benchmarking existing policy and practice as the government starting point for implementation. Currently, there may be a new immigration legislation coming for the UK, which will change things and have an impact on GCM commitments in terms of safe and legal routes. The second recommendation is on supporting the GCM through a whole of society approach. Civil society can play a particularly important role in assessing national progress, holding governments to account and sharing best practice. All organisations should make sure that this is the third recommendation. All organisations should make sure that migrants' own experiences and voices have a meaningful influence on the implementation and on migration policy making more broadly. Fourth recommendation, political leadership is needed at all levels to build a wider base of support and momentum for the GCM. For example, by designating champions for the GCM. The fifth recommendation is that the government should work in partnership with other organisations to build on links between different objectives of the GCM to avoid siloed approaches, as well as between the GCM and other frameworks. For example, stronger links are needed between the GCM and the Global Compact on Refugees, and links should also be made with the Paris Climate Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. It's critical that member states address the climate crisis and the increasing vulnerability of people on the move. There's an opportunity for the UK government to foster international cooperation to address the connections between climate change and migration, whilst hosting the UN climate change talks next year. On a final note, in this regional review, we should recognise that member states are addressing migration both at home and overseas. Many member states in this region also play an important international role as major donors of international development assistance and humanitarian aid globally. They have a diplomatic role through foreign policy with other countries through bilateral and multilateral agreements. These all have an impact on GCM implementation in the regions of Africa, Asia, and Latin America too. The same humanitarian principles that are applied to protect people overseas also need to be put into action domestically, for example, with people seeking asylum. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the British Red Cross. Just as a reminder, if I could ask everyone to try to stay within roughly 3 minutes so that we can give everyone who's requested the floor. We are now looking for our next speaker, who will be Ms. Aina Shorman-Bayeva. If you could find your unmute button and speak to us, that would be great. You've been given the floor. You'll notice there are 3 buttons at the bottom there. One is for the mic, one is for the camera, and one is the one where you indicate you're done speaking. So don't do that yet. Please go on to unmute yourself if you can see the symbol. I was being told that we're still looking for you. If we don't hear from you immediately, could I request Mr. Enrique Montes, who is the president of the Association Miraisme International, to please take the floor next. Enrique, are you there?
Yes, Christian, I'm here.
Excellent. Go ahead, please.
Hello, everybody. Good morning here in Spain. I'm going to speak on behalf of Asociación Miraisme Internacional, but I'm going to do it in Spanish, if you allow me. La Asociación Miraismo Internacional es una...
Yes, our organization is a consultative organization within the UN, and we've been actively participating in the GCM, and currently we also participate in the process of implementation through our 13 member organizations in the 13 countries where we work, especially so in the European Union and the Americas, as well as we also cooperate with some of the working groups of the network on migration. Now we would like to speak about a cross-cutting aspect to the implementation of the GCM, and we want to refer to digitalization, focusing on the European Union, and we are going to refer to some examples provided by our base organization in Spain. So, because public institutions are undergoing a very deep transformation, considering the limitations to mobility caused by the pandemic. And so, technology is used more and more to have access to basic services in the fields of employment, education, healthcare, and this creates new inequalities linked to the lack of resources or of digital knowledge. And the European Union's policy says that the administration has to offer different tools such as a higher efficiency for governments and companies, a better participation of citizens in the political life. And so the digital society has to take into account that migrants also have to have access inland with Objective 15 of the GCM. According to data from 2018, the contact with public administration through the net is lower among foreigners in all contact modalities surveyed. And in Spain, on top of that, all services that have to do with foreigners' procedures have to be done through the internet, and the information provided by lawyers and NGOs say that migrants have to wait for up to 3 months, especially because the system is totally saturated. Within the strategy for the digital society, the social inclusion policy has programs that focus especially in disabled people, but they don't strengthen this digital inclusion of migrants. And yearly reports show no data linked to demographic information other than gender. So we cannot know the limits that migrants face. And so this is a challenge. We want to gather evidence about the effective use of digital tools of the migrant community. And finally, we would like to underline the importance of reinforcing the leadership of the civil society alongside the international agencies that work with the UN Network on Migration. For us, it is very important to establish digital roundtables with local, regional, and national administrations that take into account the different social actors to make progress in the implementation of the covenant and also to make progress in the objectives. Thank you very much.
To have your inputs. Can I perhaps go back to Aina Shorman-Bayeba? We see that she has rejoined the connection. Would you be able to unmute your microphone and speak? We're trying to make that work technically, but there are still some issues. So someone from the organizers will be in touch with you to try and work that out. Could I then go next to Ms. Yijao Zhang, who is with the Office of the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants, and who would like to speak on behalf of the office. Are you able to hear us and are you able to speak, please?
Hi, good afternoon. Good morning, sorry. Good morning, colleagues, and many thanks for this opportunity to participate in this multi-stakeholder consultation on behalf of the SR. My name is Yao Zhang. I work in the Secretariat of the Special Procedure of the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. On behalf of the SR, we are participating in this consultation. The mandate has been working on a number of issues related to the GCM implementation in this region. Given the nature of migration and the specific context of the region, as stressed by Michelle and other participants and panelists earlier, the SR finds that regional dynamics is crucial for achieving the GCM objectives in this region, in particular with regard to collective responsibility to save lives of migrants in distress at sea, coordinated EU external border management that ensures the security of migrants, strengthen the regional response to smuggling of migrants, irradiating trafficking in person, and enhance the protection of migrants victims of trafficking, safe and dignified return and readmission, which guarantees due process, individual assessment, and uphold the prevention of collective expulsion. In relation to these aforementioned issues, the mandate has received information on pushbacks, violent pushbacks, forced returns outside official procedures, lack of individual assessment, and collective expulsion on land and at sea that concern the practice in this region. In the context of COVID-19 pandemic, the SR is particularly concerned about reduced capacity to save lives at sea, suspension of access to asylum procedure, and lack of appropriate COVID-19 preventive measures at immigration detention facilities. In the joint guidance note on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the human rights of migrants, prepared jointly with the Commission on Migrant Workers, the two mechanisms recommended to suspend forced returns and reduce the number of individuals at immigration detentions during the pandemic. Migrant children continue to be detained. Some are separated from their families in a number of countries in this region. The SR emphasized in his work the deprivation of liberty of adults in the context of migration must be applied as an exceptional measure of last resort. In GCM Objective 13, states are committed to prioritize non-custodial alternatives to detention that are in line with international law. To this end, the SR stresses that there is a distinction that should be made between adult migrants and migrant children. Migrant children should be considered as children first and foremost. The SR highlighted in a recent report to the General Assembly that the detention of any child for reasons related to their parents or their legal guardians' migration status is never in the best interest of the child and is always a child rights violation under international human rights law. Thus, the deprivation of liberty of migrant children should be prohibited, and the detention of children whose parents are detained should not be justified on the basis of maintaining family unit. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Gao, for highlighting these issues and reminding us also that, of course, human rights are one of the important guiding principles of the Global Compact. And so looking at some of the very pressing human rights issues in the UNECE region in this regard. I would like to perhaps once again try to see if we can connect Aina Shormanbayeva. We're giving it one more try for a moment here. I know that there's been technical assistance rendered by the operators, but unless I hear you speak right this moment, we will keep that in the back of our minds, and I'd like to go next to Miss Lola Abdukadrovia, who is Chief of Party for the Solidarity Center. Lola, if you can hear us, please go ahead with your intervention. I see there's a little bit of a delay in giving the floor. Lola, you need to request to speak at the using the button at the bottom right corner. If you could do that, we can let you in. But I now see that we have Aina online, finally. That's great news. Aina, please go ahead. We'll go to you first.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. And I need to say that me and Lola, we agreed that I will present common recommendations because we submitted a joint intervention to the network website as the alternative schedule report. And my colleague from Russia, Boris Kravchenko, already expressed some recommendations for our wide range of recommendations. But firstly, I need to just to state that the institutional problems of migrant workers in Central Asia and particularly in Kazakhstan as a civil country. For example, the absence or difficulties in accessing shelters for migrants waiting for legal proceedings, qualified interpreters, at trial and pre-trial stages of judicial hearings, support from the embassies, the state of their citizenship, for example, physical access, especially during the COVID-19 quarantine, is often difficult, and the processing of documents takes a long time. Attacks and threats against human rights defenders who protect especially irregular migrants. By state authorities, as persons who potentially hide or facilitate illegal activities. It's a problem in Kazakhstan, the corruption in migration sphere. Legal and practical restrictions on migrant workers forming or joining trade unions to exercise their workplace rights through collective action. The high cost of different documents, penalties, as well as entry and exit duties. Accessible, affordable medical care, particularly for persons with disabilities and those suffering from illnesses. And during the COVID-19, it was a very hard issue. Interdiction for migrants' legal work, except for certain entities or certain sectors, such as big companies or as domestic workers. Fear of many undocumented migrants to defend their rights by contacting public authorities because of the emerging question of their deportation. It's a problem for Central Asian countries. Failure to identify migrant workers as victims of forced labor or human trafficking. For example, we in our organization, we have 2 cases right now of a failure to identify migrants as victims of forced labor. So, and I can present the recommendations that remain recommendations of our submission. So, or you can see them on the website.
Is it possible for you to lift your face to be in camera so that the interpreters can see you? Thank you so much.
So the recommendations, main recommendations.
A little bit higher, please. A little bit higher. Thank you so much. It really makes it much easier for the interpretation. Thank you.
Address corruption among government officials, especially in law enforcement, customs, the migration police, and the labor inspection agency. Hold employers accountable for violating migrant workers' rights, including for wage theft, occupational safety, and health violations, and other workplace and contract issues. Ensure that migrant workers have access to justice and remedies for such violations. Plan labor inspections in households that employ domestic workers, especially migrant domestic workers. Migrant workers, regardless of status, should be given full access to health and medical care in destination countries. And particularly all migrant women, irrespective of their legal status, should have free access to sexual and reproductive health care, including methods of contraception, prenatal birth, and postnatal care. Creation of unified database migration, with a collection of statistics, because the migration statistics is a problem in all Central Asian countries, and this problem should be resolved. Systemize data collection of violations of labor rights.
You're dropping a bit low, Nina. Just try to be with us.
A regular discussion of labor migration issues in the framework of inter-parliamentary meetings and summits, as well as regional intergovernmental forums, because we are promoting the harmonization of policies by Central Asian countries in the field of labor migration, because 3 countries are sending countries of migrants, and Kazakhstan is the receiving country, and that's the need to discuss and to find the problems and ways to and the solutions together, all together. Thank you so much, and sorry for problems with techniques.
No worries. Thank you so much, Anna. It's great to hear from you. We have 2 potential more speakers. We do have a little more time, so I'd just like to say, if there is anybody amongst the participants who hasn't requested the floor yet and who would like to speak, please let us know. Please use the request to speak function in the app so that we can put you on the list. We will try one more time to see if Eugenia Andreyuk is online. Can you please request the floor to speak, Eugenia, so that we can give you the floor if you are there and if you are hearing us. In fact, I'm now seeing that there might be a connection issue, and Eugenia is no longer with us. In that case, I would like to go to some additional participants who've requested the floor, the first of whom is Reverend Jack Amick. Jack, please go ahead. You need to unmute yourself, Jack. Can you hit that button for us?
Right, can you hear me now?
Excellent, thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Christian, for the opportunity to speak. I can look out my window and say a new day is truly dawning on America. So thank you for this opportunity. I also want to acknowledge the importance of this type of forum that encourages inputs from civil society actors of all types. Thank you. I am the Director of Global Migration for UMCOR, the United Methodist Committee on Relief, which is the development and disaster response arm of the United Methodist Church. We've been active globally since 1940. We have a fairly active program related to migration, in which we try to work with partners to fill gaps in what we consider the 4 rights of migrants: the right to stay, the right to safe passage, the right to welcome, and the right to return with dignity. And we do that through grants making, and we do it also through ecumenical advocacy. I want to say that this forum is particularly important to us right now in places like the United States, where, as you know, in recent years, our immigration policies have not been exactly consistent with the international understandings of the rights of migrants. They used to be something that this nation championed. The use of returns, detention, the denial of access to asylum, the reduction of refugee resettlement opportunities, and the militarization of not only the border, but our immigration policy writ large are some examples of how the United States has not lived up to the high standards we once encouraged others to adopt. Additionally, for those of us representing the church, these measures have made it very difficult for us to fulfill our calling of welcoming the stranger that we take as an important biblical mandate and as part of our church and many faith traditions. Those of us from the US who are working on migration issues are excited that we will have a new administration in January. However, a reversal of some of the harmful immigration practices won't be an easy task, especially if these changes are made in such a way that makes them immune to the changing winds of politics. Therefore, it would be important that the new administration be encouraged not only from those of us who work out of the United States, but also from international actors, states and other organizations globally. In the past, as you know, moral suasion was a tool of the United States foreign policy used to encourage other nations to do the right thing. And now your gentle encouragement and affirmation of our new administration to move forward with bold steps towards immigration policy change and renewed participation in the GMC and other global fora on migration matters is going to be very, very important. We thank you for that support. We thank you for that encouragement in advance. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much, Jack. Thanks for getting up early for us, and thank you for signaling this change that we hopefully see on the horizon, and for emphasizing that we do need multilateral cooperation to hopefully make that happen. We do have a couple of other speakers who've indicated their interest. The first of them is Mauro Martini of IFAD. You have the floor, please. Go ahead. Mauro, are you there? I saw you for a second. I saw you were connected. You've been accepted to speak. But it looks like we may have lost the connection momentarily. If that's the case, I see you've inadvertently clicked the release the mic button. So we will return to you in a moment. Let me first go to Philippe Dam of Human Rights Watch. Philippe, please go ahead.
Thank you, Christian. I think I have some video issues, but I hope it's fine nevertheless. I just wanted to flag that Human Rights Watch has, and a number of other organizations have documented since the adoption of the pact, the continued number of occurrences of forced returns, pushbacks often accompanied by violence, stealing of belongings, beatings against migrant and asylum seekers at a number of borders in European countries. This pattern of abuse has often been accompanied by a lack of genuine investigation and continued impunity. For example, we collected testimonies and released videos of pushbacks and violence in Croatia, into Bosnia and Herzegovina. We documented collective expulsions, including of people picked up hundreds of miles from borders from Greece to Turkey. Also documented pushbacks at sea, sometimes with dangerous behaviors in Greece. Cases of illegal pushbacks recently and deportation from Cyprus. And similarly failures to respond to distress alert calls by Maltese and EU authorities, and pushbacks towards Italian waters or even into Libya. And finally, cases of coerced returns from Turkey to Syria. There is a somewhat healthier and growing debate in the EU among EU countries about the cost of failing to document, about the cost of failing to end abuses, and the cost of failing to hold those responsible into account. And I hope that the discussions around the implementation of the pacts on these issues can also help ensuring better impunity, ending impunity and better accountability for these kind of abuses. And I'd be interested to hear also from the panelists whether they have some particular recommendations to offer in relation to ending those abuses and building better accountability. I'll just stop here, and I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak in this discussion.
Thank you very much, Philippe. That was very important. I will now, I'm not sure if we will have time to go back to all the panelists. We will do a proper wrap-up, as you know, at the end of the day, but I'll hand back to the Secretariat in a moment to instruct us on that. Let me first now try to go back to Mauro, who can hopefully hear us and can connect this time. Mauro, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Great. Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. And my name is Mauro Martini. I work at the Financing Facility for Remittances of IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And I wanted to make a very brief intervention, particularly with regards to Objective 20 of the Global Compact for Migration, and a very good initiative, or let's call it multi-stakeholder partnership, that was set up in response to the challenges that migrants and their families receiving remittances back home were facing with the COVID pandemic. It's called the Remittances Community Task Force. And it was launched immediately after the call of the United Nations Secretary General Guterres for urgent and coordinated response to address the COVID-19 pandemic. So this Remittances Community Task Force is composed by over 40 key stakeholders and experts in the field of remittances. And among them, we have the two main diaspora organizations, ADEPT, the Africa-Europe Diaspora Development Platform, and the African Diaspora Network in Europe, ADNE. From the private sector entities, we have associations of international money transfer networks, associations of mobile company and mobile telecom companies like GSMA, but we have also individual companies like Western Union, TransferWise, World Remit, World Savings and Retail Banking Institute, and others. From the international organizations, we have, of course, IFAD, the World Bank, and other UN agency sisters. We have members from research organizations, as well as members from government agencies like AFD, the Spanish Agency for Cooperation, the German Agency for Cooperation, the Republic of Philippines, the Swiss agency, the UK agency, and as well as the European Commission. So a very broad range of all actors focused on remittances and working on the remittances field that join together to address the challenges and needs of the migrants sending remittances back home, as well as their families receiving remittances. Just to end my intervention here, the task force, the Remittance Community Task Force, is about to come out with the final blueprint for action, which is summarizing a set of measures addressed to governments, but also to remittance service providers and all the actors in the field of remittances to address those needs, those challenges faced during the pandemic. They range from declare remittances services to be considered essential during lockdown, to extend financial relief measures to eligible remittance service providers, to assist with credit and liquidity links, to consider temporary revision of transaction and balance limits, for instance, to facilitate the use and access to digital tools for migrants in sending remittances, to improve data. Just a final piece of information, all those measures already drafted have been already incorporated in the final menu of options of the UN process financing for development in the era of COVID and beyond, that was led and launched by the Canadian Prime Minister and the Jamaican Prime Minister and the United Nations Secretary General. And they are also being already forwarded to the G20 members for discussion. So I think is already a very good outcome of this multi-stakeholder partnership. And we will keep you updated about that. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mauro. Blueprint for action, I like the sound of that. We do need more action. So, you know, if organizations like yours are partnering with others to work on actionable recommendations, that's certainly something that we're happy to see. And just to remind everyone, we do have a panel, of course, on best practices in the afternoon, where we might look into some of these issues more closely. So unless I see any last minute requests to intervene, Let me just thank you, speaking of action, for a very active first round this morning. And I'm very glad to say that we've heard from a very wide range of stakeholders. So it really has been a truly multi-stakeholder process so far. An event. We've heard from the labor rights movement, we've heard from child rights activists, from youth, we've heard from human rights advocates, and we've also had, I think, a very broad geographical coverage. So, you know, taking into consideration the crucial importance of what the EU is doing in this field that was highlighted by many of you, we've also heard from Central Asia, we've heard from North America, and I think it's really good that we've been able to make sure that we've had such a breadth of participation and engagement with the process so far. So thank you all very much. And before we go into the break, I'd like to just quickly hand it back over to the Secretariat with some logistical information on the rest of the day today.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you to Christian, all of the panelists, and all of you who gave interventions from the floor for a very rich discussion. We will now take a 1-hour break for lunch. You are free to either log off the platform and log back on. If you do this, then please do make sure to log on a little bit ahead of time. For participants, a few minutes, 10 minutes ahead of time. You can also keep the platform running during the lunch break. And I would remind, for the Roundtable 2 afternoon session, moderator and panelists, please do log back on in half an hour from now. So 30 minutes prior to the start of the session. So that would be Ms. Nicoletta Giordano, Mr. Javier Kubels, Ms. Alexandra Politides-Palm, Ms. Genevieve Gencianos, and Ms. Gulnara Derbysheva. So thank you very much. Have a good lunch, and we will see you all very soon. Bye-bye. For the afternoon roundtable on best practices, on good practices in terms of engagement of stakeholders in the reviews process of the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. I'm sorry, I have an echo, but I will just walk us through the opening of the panel. I think hopefully people remember the instructions for the Kudo platform, as many of you have remained on the panel, on the platform through the lunch break. If you do have any questions, please do write the questions to the operators in the chat box. And I will now turn it over to Ms. Nicoletta Giordano of the International Organization on Migration to open roundtable number 2.
Good afternoon, participants and dear stakeholder representatives. I welcome you to this afternoon session, the roundtable discussion on best practices for stakeholder engagement in the GCM implementation, follow-up and review in the UNEC region. My name is Nicoletta Giordano. I head the International Partnerships Division at the International Organization for Migration headquarters in Geneva. I hope you can all hear me. I can barely hear me and I cannot see me, but the gist of the matter is what we say. I would like to remind all panelists, speakers and participants that they have to indicate their request to speak to our conference team by clicking on the respective request to speak icon in the bottom right corner of the screen. I hope you can all see it. It's a blue. It's on your right hand side of your screen. Now I would like to introduce today's discussion, this roundtable, which aims to look at best or perhaps even good practices for stakeholder engagement in the GCM implementation. The panel discussion, we have 4 panelists, should take around 45 minutes. And then we have about an hour for interventions from the floor. I understand that there's a number of requests for interventions, so I would urge the panelists to not only introduce themselves, but stick to their accorded time. Now, there's much to be said about best and good practices, where this is the first review, regional review of implementation, and therefore there are some good experiences already, and perhaps sharpened experience by the hard times that we're all going through at the moment with COVID, which have a specific, it's a health crisis, but it has a specific impact on migration, as we know. So some of the issues around the GCM, some of the principles might stand out even more given the heightened attention to migration flows at this point. Now, what I would like the panelists and definitely the interventions to focus on is what role and responsibilities do different stakeholders play in implementing the GCM. Let me remind everybody that we are all stakeholders, and while this session is particularly aimed at civil society, private sector, and other interest groups, the governments themselves are stakeholders. So I would recommend that when looking at implementing the GCM and what works for stakeholders, we look at all of us. What works, what doesn't, what are the practical examples and experience that you have come across to date with respect to effective practices? Does a multi-stakeholder approach towards implementing the GCM present an opportunity, or is it a challenge? And multi-stakeholder means, let's not forget, not only whole of government, but also whole of society. And how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted on the GCM implementation? How can these challenges be collectively addressed? So these are the queries, the questions that we have for you. Let me just go back to the speakers and introduce the four panelists that we have today. And please, I make amends for any misspelling of names and institutions. So our first panelist today is Mr. Xavier Cubels. He's the Director of Migration and Asylum at the Barcelona City Council. Now, Xavier Cubels Galles is Director of Migration and Asylum at the Barcelona City Council since 2020. Prior to it, he was the Director of People and Territory and Civil Rights. He has a master's degree in public policy management from the Universitat Pompeu Fabra. The city of Barcelona is actively engaged with the GCM mayors mechanism, which is co-steered by the United Cities and Local Governments, UCLG, the Mayors Migration Council, MMC, and the Internationalization for Migration. Xavier, Mr. Cubels Galles, you have the floor.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address you today. I will speak in Spanish if you allow me. It will be much easier for me. I'll explain myself better with more clarity.
That if they look at the left-hand bottom corner of their screen, they can get a simultaneous translation. So there's a button that says floor, and you have the options for translation. I'm so sorry to have interrupted you, but I just want everybody to be able to grasp what you're saying.
Ningún problema, faltaría más.
No problem whatsoever. Thank you very much. So I want to be brief, but I did want to throw up a number of good practices that we have found in the City Council in Barcelona. And not only best practices, but also I like to be able to present a few challenges that we are facing at the moment. So what do we do in the City Council in Barcelona? The Director of Migration and Asylum of the Council has a very clear objective, which not all city halls have. We are a unit, a group of people, a group of municipality experts who want to accompany the migrants in the process of arrival. That accompaniment is from a global vision and looking after the different needs that every person has. The migrants that arrived in the city of Barcelona. Obviously, a refugee, the situation of a person who's a refugee is very different from the situation of a person who comes to Barcelona in a different as a worker, as a migrant worker, or to study, or for any other reason. Therefore, we always try to know exactly the situation of the person who comes to the city. And once we know their needs, once we know that person, then we'll see what their needs are and what different services we can offer them. And the objective is always one, the inclusion of that person within the system of the city of Barcelona. So we'll help them with a transition. How do we do that? We do it in different ways. First, we have our own municipal services, which cover all the different aspects I mentioned earlier. And that's one of the best practices I wanted to share with you. That idea of global approach, we carry it out together with different organizations which support the person who are vulnerable. So they support people that when they arrive in the city are in a situation of vulnerability and need their basic needs to be covered, like housing, maintenance, etc. But also people who are not in a situation of vulnerability, people who need legal advice, they might need to obtain documents, for example, in order to have their contracts recognized or their skills, etc. So we work with different organizations. The bar of lawyers, the Red Cross, etc. And then we have another global approach. And this is another of the good practices, the best practice I wanted to share with you. So we don't only work from a central point of view. What we do is we bring this to the different territories. So this inclusion process is brought to a local level. So what do I mean by that? In each of our municipalities, we have 10 municipal districts in Barcelona. We have in each of those a team that works very closely with these people. So that means our work can be very, very good as regards helping them integrate in the area where they live. We'll help them with access to health, culture, etc. And the fact that the groups are local can help them to get integrated, to get linked and engaged with the rest of the citizenship. Another important point and another idea for best practice is the work that we do of family reunification. So we go a step ahead of the migration process. And when we have families who are living in our city and who want to bring the rest of the family members, we proactively work with those who are still in their countries of origin, so that when they arrive, we're ready. For example, if they're minors, we have their schools ready. If they've studied, we have begun to get their the certifications recognized in our city, so that when they arrive, they're ready to start to be integrated. So we work with different organizations. Obviously, we don't always work with our own resources or our own services. So we cooperate in private-public partnerships, or every entity participates in a strategic manner, and in order to help with the migration process. And also we work with networks, such as a network we are reactivating, which works on in the legal area to help migration. Another thing I wanted to point out as best practice is the relationship we have with the other administrations. There are different levels of administration. We are the local administration, the Barcelona City Council, but we also have the Generalitat, which is the autonomous region government. So the different layers of administration. So the Generalitat covers different municipalities and it's the whole autonomous area. And above that level, we have the state level. So a good practice. We are the administration which is closest to the migrants, but many times we have to take into account policies which are passed by the government or the local government, the autonomous government. For example, the foreign people's law that comes from the state. So we try to see how we can improve it. It's not our brief, it's a state's brief. And the municipalities, many times we receive a policy, but we also have to deal with the situation of different people, whether they are vulnerable or not. And might be that the state structures might not apply well to them. The policies might not be good for them. It might lengthen the process too much before they get all the papers organized, all the documents organized. And obviously that has an effect in our work. So as a challenge, I wanted to put forward the following. On the one hand, the situation of migrants that they have to face as regards the very slow process sometimes they have to go through. And it's not within our own competences. It's something that comes from the state level, and that has a negative effect in the city council and in the people, in ourselves as well, because we have to look after more situations with vulnerable people, and we have to dedicate more resources to keep that situation and allow those people to live in dignity in the city. So one of the first challenges that I wanted to put forward is that need to make those processes faster, the need for more economic resources. Obviously, the pandemic and the economic crisis means that people are even more vulnerable, so we need the resources. And an idea, which is the idea to work together with the other administrations in the area of the improvement in the return system, the system for returning people who want to return to their countries. We have to improve that process. It has to be faster, and it has to function better. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you want anything, we can continue the conversation. And if you need anything, I am here to help you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Xavier Cubells, for your intervention. There will be time for discussion, and I encourage participants to also use the messaging feature in case they have comments on the presentations, and to signal their intention to speak during the discussion session. So let me now pass on to the next speaker, Miss Alexandra Politidis Palm, a lawyer and migration policy expert, UN Major Group on Children and Youth. So Alexandra is also works with UNDOM. She is a European regional officer at the UNMGCY, the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth. She's also a lawyer and a migration policy expert at the Swedish Youth Federation for LGBTQI Rights, RFSL Ungdom in Swedish, I suppose. And the project Newcomers Youth, where she works with issues concerning LGBTQI youth with asylum experience on an individual and advocacy level. RFSL Ungdom aims to fight heteronormativity through political and social action, locally, nationally, and internationally, and is part of the UN Major Group on Children and Youth, UNMGCY. Alexandra, you hold a master's in human rights and migration law from the Stockholm's Universitet in Sweden. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Giordano, and I apologize for the amount of letters in my presentation. Good afternoon, dear colleagues within the field of migration. It is an honor to speak on this distinguished panel, and it has been very invigorating to hear all of the commitments and insight of all of you today. My name is Alexandra Politidis Palm, and I'm, as Ms. Giordana said, I'm a European Regional Officer for Migration at the UNMGCY, which is the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth. And I'm also a migration policy expert at the Swedish Youth Federation for LGBTQI Rights, RFSL Ungdom. UNMGCY is a GA-mandated self-organized space for young people to engage in sustainable development processes. And for you who don't know us, we have 14,000 members between youth-led, youth-focused, child-focused organizations and individual young people under the age of 31. Migration is a crucial issue for youth. 1 in 3 migrants worldwide is under 30. Young people are also well informed on these priorities and needs. They are critical actors and partners on the ground for GCM implementation. With the reviews scheduled for this fall, we wanted to ensure that young people are heard. We wanted to mobilize at the national and regional level to review the GCM implementation in our countries and communities, and to bring our voices to spaces such as this and the meeting later this week. We all know that this has been a challenging time, both because of the short notice and the global pandemic affecting us all. This has made it all more urgent that we include those who are usually marginalized. We built on the consultations we led this spring, in which we consulted 16 youth-led or youth-focused organizations operating in Europe, representing over 2,000 young people, including migrants. We focused on the state of labor migration pathways, skilling for employment, and partnership to tackle these issues together with other stakeholders. But as each country reviews the GCM, we needed to ensure that youth could be mobilized at the national level. We focused on consulting with 5 additional organizations based in Germany, the UK, and Portugal, representing a total of 2,300 youth, who shared with us the status of the implementation of the GCM in their communities, and their priorities for the future and their actions towards the implementation of the GCM. We reviewed objectives 7, 15, and 18. Throughout these consultations, we identified key youth priorities. And we also saw how youth really are at the forefront of the implementation of the GCM in their own countries and communities. And I will now summarize some of the great examples of this. For Objective 7 on addressing vulnerabilities, youth are leading initiatives offering support to migrants, including through referral programs to social workers and legal support, paying attention to vulnerable populations, including children and younger adolescents, and LGBTQI+ populations. For instance, the Lisbon Project Association helps migrant youth build stronger relationship with the local communities by providing them with facilitators who help them navigate existing bureaucratic channels and providing access to local support systems, such as enrollment in local schools. For Objective 15's focus on basic services, youth are focusing on providing or facilitating migrants access to services such as social support, decent housing, and education, and access to essential services such as healthcare. Project Crecer is one of those such organizations. In particular, they provide access to psychiatrists, doctors, lawyers, cultural mediators, and interpreters. For Objective 18 on skill development and facilitate mutual recognition of qualifications, young people are helping their peers find volunteering, internships, and training options to help them grow their career and skills. Migration Miteinander has done this through initiatives like ESOP, which provides in-demand vocational training, consultancy on the importance of legal residence, and identity stabilization supports. The full results of consultations, including also these priorities, are available in our policy brief that is already available online. But you can also just reach out to us to receive copies and/or discuss in more detail. As you can see, this was a successful experiment in mobilizing youth in the reviews, as we are able to gather interesting inputs and meaningfully mobilize and involve youth in the reviews. This is not the end, though. It is only the start. It is necessary to grow on this effort and mobilize more youth in more countries. First, it is necessary to work together as a civil society at the national level to ensure that civil society's inputs are listened to and taken into account by the national government. And second, this year's consultation on the GCM were the first ones. As youth, we have now built the basis in these 3 countries to lead young people's reviews at the national level. We will be doing this beyond Europe as well for the next month, but the implementation of the GCM continues, and the next reviews will be in 2022. And for that date, we aim to have a much bigger impact and mobilize youth from each country to review and advocate for inclusive GCM implementation. So friends of civil society, I hope sharing this example is helpful, and we are happy to share more as well as learn from your own efforts and experience. So let's work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Politidis-Palm. Thank you for reminding us how important the youth constituency is in migration, and for your very relevant examples tying them to the objectives themselves. I would now like to pass the mic on to Ms. Genevieve Gencianos, who is a migration program coordinator in the Public Services International. Genevieve has an extensive background on international migration, development, and human rights issues based on her more than 25 years of policy and project experience in various countries. As the migration program coordinator in PSI, her work involves building the capacity of PSI unions in national, regional, and global policy advocacy, and coordinating PSI's union development projects on migration, refugees, and internally displaced people. She holds a master's degree in public administration from the University of the Philippines and a master's degree in international development from the University of New South Wales in Australia. Ms. Gencianos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicoletta, for the generous introduction. And I thank the organizers, the Secretariat, and all the other co-panelists and our friends within civil society and other stakeholders for this very productive day of sharing inputs from stakeholders on the GCM review in the ECE region. I'm speaking on behalf of Public Services International, which is the Global Federation of Public Service Trade Unions. And in the spirit of the GCM review in the UNECE region, I am focusing my intervention on the theme of promoting human rights, safety and decent work for frontline workers while defending inclusive and non-discriminatory access of all migrants to quality public services. And in so doing, I will also aim to answer the questions posed by Nicoletta earlier on. PSI members who are public service workers, along with local government authorities, as what we heard from Javier, we are uniquely placed in promoting human rights, safety and decent work for all workers, including migrant workers, while also being at the front lines, defending inclusive and non-discriminatory access of all migrants to quality public services. The pandemic has shown how well-resourced and adequately staffed public services are crucial in fighting a public health crisis. It is the same case as we will be fighting other health crises in the future, including climate disasters and emergencies. Public service workers are among the essential workers at the front lines, providing emergency response, healthcare, social services, municipal services such as access to water, sanitation, and other basic needs. We represent these workers within our membership across the world, including in Europe and North America. We share the experiences of how our workers have been struggling in the face of the pandemic and other disasters in providing public services for all. For instance, our health sector unions have been tirelessly fighting for safety and decent working conditions, including access to protective personal equipment or PPEs for all health workers so they can continue delivering care and treatment for COVID-19 patients. We must remember that migrant workers, especially women migrant workers, represent a significant number of health and social care workers at the front lines. One example we can share is the work of the union 1199 SEIU United Healthcare Workers East, which is part of PSI affiliate, the Service Employees International Union in the United States. The union has been awarded the Humanitarian Service Award from among civil society. The 1199 SEIU United Healthcare Workers East represents over 450,000 nurses, nurse aides, techs, lab workers, clerks, housekeepers, dietary workers, transporters, pharmacists, social workers, and many other types of medical professionals. They are frontline caregivers in hospitals, nursing homes, home care, clinics, pharmacies, and all other areas of the healthcare industry. Over the years, 1199 has won some of the highest standards for healthcare workers in the USA, including good wages and benefits, safe staffing, paid time off, secure retirement, model childcare, and education benefits, and a real voice of workers in the workplace. 1199 SEIU members, which include a lot of them migrant workers, are on the front lines of this COVID-19 pandemic, and many of them suffered infections and a number of deaths. They have made enormous sacrifices to fight the pandemic and to deliver exceptional care to patients. In Europe, PSI's European organization, the European Federation of Public Services Unions, or EPSU, established from among its affiliates all over Europe, a European network of workers involved in the reception of migrants and refugees. And those workers also include what our colleague Javier have explained. They also work in those services. The European Care Network, as what we call them, the EU Care, gives voice to workers dealing with the reception of migrants and refugees. It aims to strengthen European links, support workers in delivering a public service of hospitality that respects the dignity and rights of migrants and asylum seekers, and providing a platform to discuss migration policy developments at European and national levels. A European Week of Action took place 2 weeks ago, calling for higher levels of staffing and wages in health and social care, and addressing the EU for adequate funding for the EU for Health program as an urgent first step in the midst of the second wave of pandemic in Europe. In Europe as well as in North America, our unions joined forces with civil society in fighting privatization of prisons and migrant detention centers, where migrants are disproportionately and most negatively affected, deprived of their right to liberty and subjected to inhumane conditions, including deprivation of their right to health in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. These are only some of the examples of the work of our unions in upholding our commitment as PSI to access to quality public services for everyone, including migrants, refugees, IDPs, in building and welcoming and resilient communities. In pursuit of this objective, we have joined the UN Migration Network Working Group on Access to Services, working with the co-chairs WHO and UN Habitat and other working group members in furthering Objective 15 of the GCM. Furthermore, in ensuring access to services, it is important that workers delivering the services are able to fully exercise their human and labor rights, including access to safe and decent working conditions and to fair and ethical recruitment. PSI works with our health sector unions in ensuring that health workers are able to enjoy these rights. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown the vital need for adequate numbers of health workers to provide universal healthcare services. It also highlighted the important role and contribution that migrant health workers have made to the COVID-19 crisis response. Migrant workers represent a highly significant proportion of health workers at the front lines. Sadly, many of them were among the estimated 7,000 health workers who have died from the infection, as documented by Amnesty International. The tragic and massive loss of health workers' lives is unacceptable and could have been avoided. Yet, despite these deaths and them being sung as heroes, our health workers continue to work in dangerous and difficult conditions. They are undervalued, uncompensated, and unprotected. Across the world, health workers are on strike, demanding their rights and safety at work, for just compensation, for social protection, and for their inclusion in decision-making for funding of public services. Fighting for these rights is what our unions are doing across Europe and North America and across the globe. We continue to build solidarity and support for our unions in upholding these rights through promotion of social dialogue, organizing, mobilizations, industrial actions, as well as advocacy at various levels, including at EU level, for COVID-19 to be recognized as an occupational disease. We support the work of our unions in engaging the bilateral labor migration agreements, such as the example of the Germany and Philippines BLA on nurses. We are also doing proactive work around global skills partnerships, which is part of Objective 18 of the GCM, and are building the capacity of our unions in understanding global skills partnerships and in bringing our experience into these discussions. In view of this, PSI, together with the International Trade Union Confederation and the Building and Woodworkers International, we are active members of the UN Migration Network Working Group 4 on Decent Work, chaired by the ILO and IOM, in contributing to the work of the working group in developing a guidance framework in the development of bilateral labor migration agreements, ensuring that they are gender, rights-based, fair, and ethical. In conclusion, PSI fully agrees that the UNGCM is a living framework, providing guidance to member states and all stakeholders as we battle through this pandemic and beyond. We forge our commitment to build back better together, built on the foundations of human rights and on just and redistributive social policies and public services that support inclusive and welcoming communities. Thank you, and over to you, Nicoletta.
Thank you, Genevieve. Thank you very much for your exhaustive illustration. Before I pass on to the last speaker on this panel, I wanted to ask those that have already requested the floor today during the discussion time to actually start hitting the request to speak button so that we can put them on readily when the discussion begins. So let me just call them out. So we have Mr. Piotr Ostrowski, Mr. Christian Wolf, Ms. Joanna Moore, Mr. John Bingham, Mr. Pablo Rojas Copari, and then Mr. Yao Zhang, and Ms. Eugenia Andreyuk. Can you start, those that I have listed, can you please start pressing your request to speak button so we know that you can come on smoothly after the last presentation. And we can make sure that technically you're able to actually make your intervention. So may I now pass over to the panel floor to Ms. Gulmara Derbysheva. She is the Executive Director of Insan Leylek NGO, which is a solidarity center and a long-time partner in migrant worker advocacy in Kyrgyzstan. Gulnara is an accomplished advocate with decades of experience in promoting policies that protect migrant workers and providing them concrete support, both within the communities in Kyrgyzstan that are most deeply impacted by outbound migration and in destination countries. As a human rights activist who lives in one of the poorest regions of Kyrgyzstan, she is committed to helping the unemployed, destitute and elderly people of rural Kyrgyzstan through her work with two funds designed to overcome poverty, educate and protect the rights and interests of the people of the Kyrgyz Republic. Gulnara Derbysheva, the floor is yours.
Спасибо большое. Вы знаете, Кыргызстан является одним из самых больших отправляющих сообществ.
Many things. As you know, Kyrgyzstan is one of the most important major countries of origin, and Turkey and Germany are the countries of destination for many of our migrants. Our organization is providing direct support to many groups of migrants, helps them to organize in trade union organizations, and so on. In terms of countries that have joined the Global Compact, we would like to keep those countries open for our migrants. For example, as far as Russian Federation is concerned, where millions of Kyrgyz workers are going every year, unfortunately, we have to state that every year the migration legislation becomes more and more stringent. For example, Russia has recently introduced measures which make it much more difficult for the migrants to get registered. Thousands of migrants found themselves undocumented and in fact illegal, unregulated, because they, as a consequence, violated the migration legislation and therefore were blacklisted. Unfortunately, they will be denied access to the Russian Federation due to many reasons, no matter how minor those violations are, and sometimes specifically due to the fact that there were recent changes to the legislation. We would like to voice our request and concern and call on the countries of destination not to make their legislation and their rules more stringent. I'd like to note the work with our partners, in particular in the area of female workers. We see a trend which we can describe as feminization of migration. A lot of migrant women leave the countries, and of course they become the most vulnerable group of migrants. They experience harassment. Many women request our assistance, and very often complain that they have no access to the basic social and medical services. Very often women face harassment, and when they were facing harassment, they could not obtain either medical or psychological assistance from public bodies. Why? Because they didn't have any medical insurance and therefore were denied those services. So we would like to request the countries of destination to ease the access for this category of migrant workers to those essential services, irrespective of their migration status, even if their status is unregulated or those migrants are undocumented, they need to have the right to use those services. Of course, the pandemic has affected us deeply. We have certain data. 45% of the migrants that we helped have lost their jobs. 30% were sent on unpaid leave without any explanation and without any arrangements for continuing their work later, even if they had formal contracts. 10% of the migrant workers were fired without any reason, and only 10% of migrant workers managed to retain their jobs, and only 5% managed to find a new job. So their situation is very, very precarious and very uncertain. They're hoping that once the pandemic is over, they would be able to either go back to work or find a new job. So we would like, of course, to see the situation where countries of destination remain attractive and remain available and have jobs available for migrants. And we are hoping that will be the case. As for the countries of origin, it is important for those countries, and Kyrgyzstan in particular, to prepare migrants for such an important step. Very often, migrants leave without any preparation. They have no idea what they will face. They face very unwelcome reception from law enforcement agencies. They face abuse and fraud, and of course, precarious situation at their workplaces, such as the lack of health and safety conditions. So we, as the country of origin, believe that we have to prepare the migrants to manage their expectations, involving not only civil society or human rights organizations, but also government bodies. And therefore, migrants need to be united so that once they reach the country of destination, they were able to demand and enjoy their rightfully deserved social rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bisheva. And your very poignant intervention concludes the panelists' presentations. There's been an effort in this multi-stakeholder consultation to make sure that all categories of stakeholders are given the opportunity to contribute. So, as already mentioned, we have an hour for discussion, and a number of other representatives, or stakeholder representatives, have requested the floor. So I will list them out to make sure that there's still all connected and able to make their intervention. And I will list them in the order of intervention. So Mr. Piotr Ostrowski, Mr. John Bingham, Miss Eugenia Andreyuk. I understand Miss Yayo Zhang will not be making an intervention. Miss Joanna Moore, Mr. Pablo Rojas Copari, Miss Kekeli Kmnon, I hope I pronounced that right, but and Miss Katarina Stam of Diakonia International. So may I request Mr. Piotr Ostrowski to take the floor for his intervention. Let me remind everybody we've got about an hour for this discussion. Some key questions were posed. What role, responsibility do different stakeholders play in implementing the GCM? What works, what doesn't? What are the practical examples? Does a multi-stakeholder approach towards implementing the GCM present an opportunity, or is it just a challenge? How has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted on GCM implementation, and how can those challenges be collectively addressed? Without any further ado, I call upon Mr. Ostrowski. Are you there, and can you take the floor? So Mr. Piotr Ostrowski, I understand, is not able to take the floor now. So may I call upon Mr. John Bingham to take the floor, please? And John and everybody else, hello, John. May I also ask that you introduce yourselves briefly? So who you are you representing, and any other relevant information, but brief, please.
Very good. Thanks, Nicoletta, and thanks IOM and the UN Network European Commission for Europe. My name is John Bingham, and I'm happy to speak on behalf of the International Organization of Employers. IOE has 150 member national employer federations and partner companies in 140 countries around the world, many in this region. IOE was active with our members and directly with UN member states in the consultations and negotiations that led to this landmark global compact for migration. Our members believe very strongly in this compact as a menu of commitments to practical alternatives and solutions that was carefully negotiated and adopted by more UN member states than have adopted even some widely recognized international conventions. Today, we offer 4 points specifically on practice and stakeholder partnership. First, among the Compact's 21 objectives, our members place greatest priority in 4 areas of concrete practice. Notably in the Compact, these objectives list the greatest number of actions of all. Expanding regular pathways with regulatory frameworks for mobility of workers across skills levels based on predictable and transparent migration policies that reflect demographic realities and labor market needs, including skills shortages. Expanding responsible recruitment practices, in particular for medium and lower skilled migrant workers. Improving skills identification, recognition, and development for better matching migrant workers and their skills to labor market and employment needs. And finally, leveraging technology and innovative private sector solutions to do all of this better. Second, on the ground in this region and worldwide, our members know that in a globalized world with enormous and widening imbalances of population, labor, skills, and income, these priorities and practices were key before the pandemic and economic crises and will be essential for recovery from them. In fact, these priorities were reaffirmed in a declaration that 17 national employers organizations across Asia adopted in August, not before the crises, but right in the middle of them. Third, within our inputs to this process, we have initiated regular meetings with focal points among our employer members in several regions for peer exchange of perspectives and practices, especially on the priorities just mentioned. We have worked since last year on 4 studies of labor migration and related business perspectives in and from Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, and South America, all regions of origin of migrants to ECE member states. We also aim to present that research in the Global Forum Summit in January. We have undertaken a review of our 2018 position paper on labor migration in order to offer our further experience and perspectives specifically in the current pandemic and economic crises. Fourth, and to close, one of the lessons of these linked crises is urgency. Another lesson is how much shared interest and common ground for action there is among governments, employers, and other actors. In the field of international labor migration, employers continue to be interested, of great value, and belong in every dialogue whose starting point is experience and commitment is to action. Thank you.
Thank you, John. We now have Ms. Eugenia Andreyuk of Anti-Discrimination Center Memorial Advocacy Officer, who has requested to speak. Ms. Andreyuk, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicoletta. Thank you for having me and for inviting. I'm working in Anti-Discrimination Center Memorial, and we are covering the region of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, Eastern Europe, which is non-EU, and working with the vulnerable groups, including migrants and stateless persons, and we mainly work on labor migration. So for sure, first of all, we welcome very much GSM General and consultations, and for us in the region, where, as before me, Ms. Gulnara stated, many states who are recipients of migrants have not ratified the Convention on the Rights of Labor Migrants. And in these conditions, basically, the Global Compact is the only instrument for us to use somehow for legal obligations of states, and it's extremely useful. So we welcome very much consultations, and also looking forward to reports, both regional and final, to use them further in national advocacy, because it's extremely important for us, and it's the way also how we're working with international mechanism. So as for COVID-19, for sure, and also it was mentioned before me, that COVID-19 has terrifying effects to migration population. First of all, because the majority lost their jobs, and many families lost their only source of income, and unfortunately we register that in the region many families now do not have basic funds to cover very basic needs. I mean, it's literally people do not have enough money to have food for all family members. Except that, for sure, there is a problem with blocked borders, as we have, for example, such phenomena as temporary camps. For example, in Russia, when migrants from Central Asia try to cross back and try to go back, but because of the lack of any flights and any other transport, they just stay temporarily in tents, waiting for any possibility to go back. And for us, COVID-19, for sure, it's an issue, and I'm sure that it's a right platform to think of how could labor migration be evolved further in more fair manner, and to have less exploitative character, to provide more for the rights of labor migrants. And I'm sure that there is unfortunately a challenge for this year, next year, but also now we aware that pandemics will come back. And my last point, and it's part of our best practices, we are working specifically for the last year with children migrants in the region. We have a regional agreement, Chisinau Agreement, in accordance with which children migrants are often placed in detention and returned with violation of very basic rights. And here we try to work to elaborate new regional agreements on return of children, mainly bilateral between states. And we see that as for the regional level, but also at other international level and also with EU member states, that important instruments to be used to have specific agreements on return of children migrants with all the guarantees for children migrants to respect their rights. And here we also use a lot of multi-stakeholders experience. We are working with government representatives of now specifically Ukraine and Moldova, and actually there is very favorable approach, and we see that it's really very profitable and very beneficial. So it's basically like my argument for stakeholder work and any engagement. So with that, I'm closing. Thank you very much for opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Ms. Andreyuk. And I now would like to call upon Ms. Joanna Moore of the British Red Cross, Humanitarian Policy and Advocacy Advisor, Policy Lead on Migration and Displacement. Ms. Moore, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be speaking on behalf of the British Red Cross. Last year, we helped nearly 11,000 people separated from their families to reconnect or look for their loved ones. We supported over 3,000 people to be reunited by assisting with family reunion, visa applications, and arranging travel for those families to reach the UK safely. This year, British Red Cross has been a key contact point with the UK Government Home Office on COVID-19. This involved weekly phone calls with Home Office officials, feeding in and out issues and information on the impact of COVID-19 and on people seeking asylum. The whole of society guiding principle of the Global Compact is critical to successful implementation. The voices of migrants with lived experience and diaspora need to be heard to ground GCM principles and objectives in reality and shape migration policymaking. Their participation and leadership is crucial. British Red Cross works closely with networks led by and for people with experience of migration and seeking asylum in the UK, for example, the Voices Network. They have the opportunity to speak with MPs, members of Parliament, in the UK Parliament and with the UK Government Home Office. And I'm hoping that our Voices Network ambassador will speak at the review meeting on Thursday to share her own experience of migration and integration in the UK. The British Red Cross has played a convening role in bringing the voices of people with lived experience into roundtable policy dialogues with UK government departments. And government officials don't always have the opportunity to interact with migrants themselves. We have found that starting with these perspectives is powerful and often leads to government officials referring back to the points that migrant representatives have made in the rest of the roundtable discussions. For example, one of the migrant representatives at the discussions told us, "Vulnerability is feeling like I have no voice of my own, feeling like I'm not being treated like a human being. I should be protected and respected regardless of personal characteristics because I'm just a human." This led to a discussion on agreeing a definition of vulnerability for the GCM implementation. Overall, efforts should be made to support local organisations, local government authorities, diaspora groups and migrants themselves to address vulnerabilities, including through investment in their capacity to do this. We have seen an implementation gap between GCM commitments on migrants' access to basic services and day-to-day realities. Migrants face many barriers to accessing services, from eligibility restrictions and high costs to language barriers and fear of arrest or deportation. This can be overcome by rooting approaches in the needs and experiences of migrants, joining up national and international conversations with local investment and linking this work in with wider efforts to reduce vulnerabilities amongst migrants. On a final point, the GCM recommended that member states develop national plans. National plans, as well as stakeholder consultation mechanisms, would allow civil society and migrants themselves to hold member states accountable. We have found that not all government departments are aware of the GCM. For a whole of government approach, steps should be taken to promote awareness of the GCM among domestic-facing departments and local authorities, and how it is relevant and important to their work. This is a foundation for developing a cross-government vision or strategy for implementing the GCM. As a British Red Cross, we will continue to convene dialogues between governments, migrants and civil society to ensure that the GCM implementation makes a difference to people's lives over the next year and in the lead up to the review in 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. I would like now to call on Mr. Pablo Rojas Coppari of OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, and he is the Migration and Freedom of Movement Advisor. Mr. Coppari, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for introducing me. I will be very brief. I just wanted to react on some of the examples that I heard in the panel. And I just wanted to mention that I was very happy to hear that across the ECE region, we have very positive experiences of migrant workers organizing, both self-organizing, but also organizing through migrant groups. I wanted nonetheless to just make a point about the barriers that still exist in our region for the freedom of association of migrants, and to be conscious that the barriers to freedom of association represent an obstacle for the effective implementation of the Global Compact and its objectives. Just to touch upon that point, I think the barriers happen, some of the barriers are enshrined in legislation, both in terms of migrants organizing, but also organizations advocating on behalf of migrants. But there are other structural barriers which prevent migrants from advocating for their rights. In that, I was very happy to hear some of the labor movement talking very positively about the inclusion of migrant voices in there. But unfortunately, that still is not the case all across the ECE region. I would also like to point out that for meaningful engagement of migrants as stakeholders in the GCM process, we need to focus on those who are most marginalized, including undocumented migrants and others with precarious migrant status, and ensure that their voices can be heard. Some of the barriers to participation of those groups, like the barriers to participation of those groups, are multifaceted. Some of them are related to invisibility, but some of them are also related to broader societal problems, including access to services and access to rights. So in that regard, if I could recommend something, I would recommend implementation of firewalls, because even so, firewalls are mostly associated with access to services. Societies where firewalls are in place allow for a greater participation of undocumented migrants and precarious migrants in a whole society sort of discussion. I want to finish there. I hope my contribution was somehow useful. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you, Mr. Coppari. I now call upon Mr. Christian Wolf from ACT Alliance, Program Manager, Migration and Displacement. Christian, the floor is yours. I can't hear, but others perhaps can. Have you? Yes, we can't hear you. It's not only me. You have, of course, pressed. Yes, there you are. We can hear you now. Okay.
Let's use less technology.
Okay.
Okay. So
I was saying thank you very much for having me back as a respondent for this panel. I think it's very encouraging to hear today from the wide variety of levels at which stakeholders, including and especially civil society, have been engaged in direct implementation and advocacy, trying to guide implementation, analyzing and monitoring implementation, and also facilitating consultations, talking to other groups around GCM implementation. Just a brief sort of thumbnail sketch of some of the activities of work of ACT members on social inclusion. Civil society, including our members, have traditionally been very closely involved in promoting inclusion and integration of migrants in our society. As we also heard earlier, this includes states where official government policies have either been absent or actively detrimental to the achievement of GCM objectives. On human rights protection, pathways, and decent work, there's been a lot of work in the provision of life-saving assistance and humanitarian protection to people on the move, including in mixed movements, which increasingly characterize flows towards the UNECE region. Let me also say that this work has become increasingly challenging during a period of toughening border restrictions, coupled with the absence of sufficient regular pathways. On border protection, on human rights protection and border management, civil society, including our members, have been instrumental in saving lives and providing humanitarian assistance to people on the move, including and especially in situations of vulnerability, which continue to be widespread. This includes, for example, migrants caught at the borders of the EU, for example, on the Mediterranean and the Greek islands, as well as in the Central American corridor en route to the US. Activities here include emergency assistance, but also longer-term integration efforts of people forced to return, including with a specific focus on LGBTI and other marginalized groups. On countering discrimination, which is the last roundtable theme we're looking at, civil society, including faith-based actors, are essential communicators and interlocutors, especially at community level. And in these roles, we've traditionally been messengers of welcome and inclusion, bridge builders for newcomers, both in spiritual but also very practical contexts. Now, apart from all these examples, I think what the challenge has been is that alongside that, the question is, how do we promote active stakeholder engagement in GCM implementation? I mean, I'd like to flag that the UN Major Group on Children and Youth's presentation was very good on that. But we should also reflect a little bit on who have we not heard from yet today or in this process. So, why is it that we do not hear more migrants' voices in these discussions? We know that, looking at the UNECE region, there are relatively few governments that have directly and purposefully engaged multi-stakeholders on GCM implementation. Rather, as we've heard, it often happens the other way around, i.e. stakeholder groups get together, they organize themselves, they initiate discussions, and more often than not, we find that it's quite difficult for them to then find the right counterparts to talk to in government. Although I would also like to note that we need to differentiate here between local levels of government, municipalities, we heard from them, mayors, etc., on the one hand, and on the other hand, central or federal governments, where a lot of times the mechanism hasn't quite been worked out yet, and there's still a lot of work to be done. And finally, in that context, I'd like to mention that you're all aware of the Champion Countries initiative of the Network on Migration. There are, I think, about 14 countries right now. Only 2 of them, Portugal and Canada, are from the UNECE region, even though there are others who are within the region who are supporting the network in other ways, for example, through the Multi-Partner Trust Fund. So there also the question is, how can we sort of make that engagement more holistic and avoid the impression that governments and countries that see themselves primarily as destination countries are not only looking at GCM implementation as something that they have to support elsewhere, but as something that also has to be done at home. So looking at that, and we know that some of them are observing us today, and we do welcome that, and we hope that they feel inspired and to take the next step in collaborative implementation, looking at the outcomes of this regional review and then working towards the IMRF in 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, for your brainstorming on a number of issues. May I now have the pleasure to pass the floor on to Ms. Kekeli Kopignon from QCEA. Perhaps, Ms. Kopignon, you may introduce yourself and what does QCEA stand for, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you for giving me the floor. So QCA is the Quaker Council for European Affairs. We are a Brussels-based Quaker organization working to bring a commitment to peace, justice, and equality to Europe and European institutions. And part of the work focuses on how to advance a more human approach to migration and asylum in Europe. So it's really responding to some of the things that have been shared since this morning. And it has been mentioned how the European Union has released a number of new policies and more will come affecting migrants. And it has also been pointed that some of those policies are contrary to the spirit of the Global Compact on Migration, which is very much rooted in human rights language. And our experience working in Brussels for the past 4 decades shows the disconnect between the language on migration that is spoken at the global level and the conversation happening at the European level. That, in a way, part of the challenge, but also the opportunity that we have now is to bridge and bring that global language to European level policy making, so that it can inform the implementation of the compact. One of the way we have been working is in convening different stakeholders, those who tend to live parallel lives when it comes to where they do advocacy, where they work. And it has been mentioned how some voices tend to be missing from the conversation. So how can we be intentional in bringing those aboard? How can we have more inclusive spaces? How can we stress the fact that when we talk about whole of society approach, it means all segments of society, but it also means that when we talk about migration, when we talk about issues of integration, that tends to be seen in silo, at least at the European policy level. The onus tend to be placed on migrants, but we need to make more efforts to engage so-called host populations, so that there can be a true sense of ownership of the topic, and that migration doesn't remain in the realm of technical advocacy or instrumentalized at policy level. Some of the questions that we also ask are, how are we challenging assumptions? Are we challenging practices when it comes to the implementation of migration policy? How are we promoting alternative way of thinking and doing? What connections are we making, and what silos are we breaking? And my final point will be that policies are not created in vacuum. Policy makers not only shape but also influenced by the society they live in. So unless the implementation of both the Global Compact and EU migration policies take into account relations of power, historical links, inequality and injustices will be repeated despite good intentions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kopignon. We're now to the last intervention that we have listed. Unless more are coming through, I will give the floor over to Ms. Katarina Stam from
Germany. Yes, thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Yes, I have just 3 general remarks. Thank you very much for this exchange of stakeholders. Okay, first of all, I'm Katharina Stamm from Diakonie Germany. We are actually doing very much work on the ground, which means legal advisory desks or advisory desks, social work for migrants in every stage of the migration process. We have also community-based projects and As a welfare organization in Germany, we are quite big actually, and we also serve together in the Protestant Agency for Diaconia and Development together with Bread for the World. And see the whole migration process from the countries of origin to Europe. And we do advocacy on the level of the federal state, on the governmental level, and EU state. So I think really this exchange in the UNICE region is really an added value, because we are in Europe, the European Union is quite concentrated on their, let's say, entity, and I think to look beyond, and because migration is far beyond that, from EU and into EU, it's we really need to look at more east and west, from Canada to Russia. So I think that this is really very good to leave the EU concentrated area, and because the policies need to be made in the whole, with the whole picture. And so I'm also looking forward to 2022 to have a broader picture as well. So I think yes, this is my first remark. I think we need to address migration globally, and this shows me that we really have to have knowledge first of all, and this exchange is very crucial. So I mean, I think I have a challenge with the broad thematic issue. We have from rescuing operations in the at sea until migration, migrant workers' rights. We have a lot of issues. So how to exchange better on a expert level and to build up common standards. I think, and here I think our voice as civil society and academia and faith-based organization, I think it's really important that we mainstream our positions and to push it more on the to push for more global standards. For example, for child detention, or even better, during the migration process, family reunification. I think this is a big issue, and of course also standard for migrant workers. So just to name a few, and a human rights-based approach. I think this we all have in common, and I think it's really important to have a common understanding of that, and to raise the voice. And I think this multi-stakeholder approach and whole of society approach is quite modern and very, very, very good. If you compare it to other UN instruments where states write their reports every 2 or 4 years, and civil society can also submit a report. But I think this is really a very good structure now, to have a stakeholder meeting before that. It's more on this. We are more on the same level, talking to member states, because I think migration in the end is done on a local level. Civil society organizations who serve on the ground, like cities and communal entities, they know it's crucial, and what is needed for the migration process. And and as a last remark, I really liked what my predecessor was saying, and Joanne Moore from the British Red Cross, how to make the voice more diverse, and how we can reach more migrant self-organizations. And I have to admit, also our organizations have to be more diverse if we're doing advocacy work for migrants. So it's also a challenge for us, especially faith-based organizations, to make us more diverse. That automatically more migrant perspectives is included in the whole process. So, but thanks a lot, and I think it's really crucial. I'm looking forward to this very new process, which is, I think, has an added value. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Dam. You are in fact the last intervention that we had listed, and unless there are more participants who would like to intervene at this stage. Let's not forget that there's over 100 persons listening or participating to this session. If there are no more interventions from the floor, then I would like to call upon the panelists of this second session for some closing remarks. So should the panelists wish to join the panel in order to rejoin the panel in order to make closing remarks, they would need to push the request to speak button. Let me call on them. Mr. Xavier Kubelj, Ms. Alexandra Politidis Palm, Ms. Genevieve Grantianos, and Ms. Gulnara Derbysheva. So please let us know whether you would like to make some final remarks. And if so, please push on your request to speak button. Do I have any takers, or have the interventions totally exhausted the panelists?
Yo, si me permiten, sí que
Please.
querría.
If you allow me, I would like to intervene, please.
Okay. Xavier Cubell.
Mr. Xavier Cubell from the City Council of Barcelona. I just wanted to make a closing comment. Some of the people have mentioned it, and I think it is important. When we talk about a higher participation of migrants in the process, it is important to find formulas for that. And I wanted to put forward an idea. First, we have to be able to ensure that these people are in a stable situation with their basic needs covered, and then is the moment we have identified here in Barcelona, then is when they can participate. That's when they begin to really participate and engage. It's normal. I am not saying anything new, but I think it was important to share it with you. We have two phases. The welcoming phase. So a number of people need their basic needs covered, like housing or whatever. And then afterwards, we work with different organizations so that these people can participate in life in the city of Barcelona. Just a short reflection to close. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cobellis, for that, the practical side of government and a suggestion. I now would like to give the floor over to Ms. Alexandra Politidis Palm of UNMGCY. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you for this very interesting discussion. And as a comment to the previous speakers, I would also like to just remind everyone that we have in our organization put forward some sort of method to actually collect the voices of migrants in Europe, and also youth that are working directly with migrants. So we look forward to here cooperating with you on this particular issue of actually bringing the voices of migrants to this kinds of reviews and to the further discussion on different kinds of level. But thank you very much for an interesting discussion, and I look forward to hearing from you and cooperating in the future.
So thank you, Ms. Politidis Pan. We all do. And now it's the turn of Ms. Genevieve Gencianos. The floor is yours from Public Service International.
Thanks again for giving us the opportunity to say some last words. I completely agree with the interventions in terms of underscoring the importance of diversity of voices and the role of stakeholders in this process. And indeed, it is very positive, and we welcome this process as it's going so far. And I would like to really acknowledge that as said by one of the speakers as well in the interventions, that the UN Global Compact on Migration is quite unique because it has within the compact the recognition of the stakeholders in the implementation review, and in the success of this Global Compact really relies on all of us as stakeholders working together. And one last point that I would like to emphasize is for us, as we do this review in the regional levels as well as global, as what we are experiencing now, we do not forget the lessons from this pandemic. This is our opportunity, again, to repeat the words that I've said, to build back better and really to work collectively together for just policies that will address the inequalities that have been laid bare in this pandemic, and that we need radical solutions that address the structural drivers of forced migration that actually put migrants as well as host communities in vulnerable situations. So we need this holistic approach, we need this radical approach, and we really need not to go back to normal, but to work for a much, much better normal after this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gencianos. I see no more interventions. I will be checking again.
Nicoletta, we do have one other intervention request.
Yes, I see. Thank you, Mon Ami. And I need to acknowledge again the help of Mon Ami Maulik as well as Franz Fischer in order helping us, in fact, being in charge of the session and making sure that we can all have a voice and speak in order. I see that the German Primary Mission has requested to also make a statement. So please, can you introduce yourself before you actually make the statement? Over to you.
Nicoletta, I believe the speaker who's requested should press the request to speak button again, because I think the release the mic button was pressed, which removes one from the panel.
Very good. So if the German representative is able to hear us, can you please request to speak again, or press the request to speak button again? There we go.
Can you hear me? So
yes, we can hear you. Please introduce yourself.
Yes. Well, thank you for giving me the floor. I just I'm working for the permanent mission in Geneva, and I'm covering migration there. And I just wanted to say that this was very helpful and interesting, and a very good preparation for the meeting later this week. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for that voice of support. I sometimes feel that online consultations are more arduous to follow because you really have to come to the meat of the matter. We are at the beginning of the process, and I'm sure this morning Jonathan Prentice must have pointed out that this is the first region that has embarked in a regional review. And therefore, this is the first multi-stakeholder consultation that has been held in anticipation of the regional review, the state-led regional review that will take place in a couple of days. I understand, and you will all have noticed from the concept note, that the rapporteur will report on the outcomes of the multi-stakeholder consultation during the opening segment of the intergovernmental meeting for the GCM review in the EC region on 12th and 13th November. I think you've heard from the rapporteur herself this morning. This consultation will result in a summary as well, which will synthesize inputs, and it is being recorded. Having said that, I thank the panelists. This is indeed, this session provided a bit of, was a good opportunity for a number of empirical experiences to be shared, and empirical examples that actually bring the GCM alive for how it was intended, from an aspirational document into a more pragmatic approach to things. Yes, a number of participants have pointed to the gap that still exists, but we're at the beginning of the process. The need for more diversity, for the inclusion of migrants, and how to do that. And a number of suggestions were made on how to do that. I will not drag this session any further. I am proud to report that despite the many panelists and a number of interventions, we have managed to finish before time. So I am happy to close this session now, unless there are any further speakers that would like to intervene at this point, and so that we can have a closing session as soon as possible. I understand, please stay on this session so that we can go into a closing session, unless, Mon Ami, you tell me that there's going to be another interval.
I believe we can move to the closing session. We don't see any other requests to speak.
Very good. I thank you all. I thank the panelists, and I thank all the speakers that made interventions afterwards, and the panelists for their responses. I hope you can all stay for the closing session, and bye for now.
Thank you very much, Nicoletta, and to all of the panelists and all of those who intervened from the floor for the Roundtable 2 and final panel discussion. We will now come back to our opening speakers, and first we will go to Michelle Lavoie, our rapporteur for today's consultation. Michelle will share with us some preliminary observations and summaries. And as you may know, Michelle, as the rapporteur, will work on formulating these and presenting these at the opening panel for the first day of the Intergovernmental Regional Review. So Michelle, I ask you to speak first, and right after Michelle, we'll close up today's meeting with Jonathan Prentice. Please go ahead, Michelle.
Thanks very much, Mon Ami and Nicoletta, and once again for the Secretariat's help in organizing this. So I would just like to give some brief remarks here at the end to try to pull together in just a first way possible the very rich discussion that we had today. And as Mon Ami said, we'll make this into a report and we'll deliver it on Thursday morning. So we'll try to be as true as possible to the very diverse inputs. So I think the starting point is that we've had a discussion that's been very diverse because our region, the UNISA region of the UN, is actually very diverse geographically, very wide, and we have very different contexts in this region. Many of the countries in this region would see themselves as countries of destination, and many of them would also see themselves as having a high level of social policies. One of the countries in this region, one of the participants noted, the United States has immigration policies that used to be something that the US championed. So we would also see this most likely in other countries, maybe in the Europe region as well, of countries that have maybe seen immigration in a very positive light previously, and maybe also currently. This region, because it's so wide, also has many subregions. We have Central Asia, the South Caucasus, and the Western Balkans. And we've also heard that this region isn't just countries of destination. We also have countries of origin. And we've heard from various colleagues based in those countries of origin, especially in Central Asia, that in general, one of their recommendations is that countries of destination should not make rules so stringent for migrants. So while we have such a broad region, it was actually quite striking to hear so many similarities. And I wanted to group these together either by themes or by objectives. And the first two would be objectives. So looking at Objective 11 of the Global Compact on Migration, which is managing borders in an integrated, secure, and coordinated manner. We've actually heard in this UNISA region that there's multiple violations of Objective 11. How many times have we heard the word pushbacks, coerced returns, collective expulsions, both at land and at sea, people who were criminalized as civil society advocates, as migrants themselves, because they were providing humanitarian assistance as human rights defenders. So we've heard a recommendation that there should be more transparent governance, there should be more monitoring at borders, including by national human rights institutions. States should not only provide this possibility that the monitoring should take place, but they should also resource it. And the independent monitors should have access to data. We need more accountability at borders. This was a point that was raised a couple of times, and also the word impunity was raised, particularly concerning border situations. We need to end abuses and we need to end impunity at borders. Another objective is Objective 13, the use of migrant detention only as a measure of last resort and working towards alternatives. We've heard that deprivation of liberty should be a measure of last resort. Deprivation of liberty of children should be prohibited, as well as parents of children should not be detained together with their children. However, across, once again, this very wide region, children continue to be detained. And they're not the children are not considered to be children first. They're considered to be migrant children, and they're consistently detained. The EU proposal on the Migration and Asylum Pact would only make this situation worse. So the recommendation is to exclusively use alternatives to detention and to make more specific reference by UN member states to prioritize alternatives to detention. We had a whole discussion around labor rights. And I've noted these three objectives. There might be a couple other ones of the Global Compact, but Objective 6 on decent work, Objective 18 on skills recognition, Objective 22 on the Social Security entitlements. We had very good input here from unions, especially in Central Asia region, who actually provided very useful data of surveys that they've actually taken, that they've distributed during the pandemic to see how many migrant workers have been fired, have lost their contracts, have not been given any pay, etc. And we've also heard a recommendation in general that despite such good data and good involvement, there is a recommendation in general across the region, not only Central Asia, but across the broader region, to include migrant voices in the labor movement. The global standards should be applicable here concerning migrant workers. They're established in both the Global Compact on Migration as well as the various ILO conventions, and they should apply to migrant workers regardless of status. So one of the strongest recommendations that has been repeated a number of times is that migrant workers should have the freedom to associate, to join, and to form unions. This is not guaranteed across the union. There should be the freedom from discrimination. Legislation should be amended to uphold safe working conditions, and migrant workers should have access to decent health care and social protection. There also should be moves to tackle corruption amongst governmental officials, especially law enforcement, and employers should be held accountable for violating migrant workers' rights and to ensure that migrant workers have access to justice. We also had a whole focus on children. We talked about the best interests of the child. This is actually proposed as a concept in the new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum, but it has to be fully implemented. One of the ways to do this is by increasing access to family reunification and eliminating the many different barriers and obstacles that children have to reunite with their family members. We heard very interesting examples of cities, city-level solutions that work proactively with countries of origin to prepare people who are going through the family reunification process for their safe arrival and integration once they arrive in the country of destination. And this really relates to Objective 5 of the GCM pathways for regular migration. Concerning children, we heard a lot about access to education, the need to have access to mental health and psychosocial support, regardless of status. This concerns Objective 15 of the Global Compact. And we also heard about Objective 21, which is return. We heard an interesting practice of civil societies and some governments in the Caucasus region working together concerning the return of children. And when we talk about children, we also kind of segment into youth, because after the age of 18, children become youth. And so aging out is an issue. Many protections that children have actually stop when they're 18, so there's a need to continue these. It's also important when we look at youth, numerically speaking, because 1 out of 3 migrants worldwide are youth who are under 30. The youth are very mobilized. Young people are very mobilized in general. We heard numerous examples of how they're mobilizing that relate to the GCM. One of them is Objective 7, which is looking at vulnerability. We heard of youth leading initiatives to implement LGBTI outreach, and also concerning skills building and job applications. And we also had a very big discussion around Objective 15 on access to services, where we still see across the region in general a big gap in implementation. We see that the inequalities that were real concerning migrants before the pandemic started only were augmented during the pandemic. We've seen that migrant children had difficulty attending school. There was a need for all migrants, including migrant women, and this was mentioned several times, to accessible and affordable healthcare and to be free from harassment when doing so. We've heard about the needs in general during the pandemic and some of the governmental responses, which were actually seen as somewhat positive, even from the national governmental level. Concerning access to services, we've also heard about migrants who actually provide the services, migrant health workers, and strong union organizing in the United States and Europe, where as health workers, they've been part of a movement to secure high standards for the sector, but where in general they still face a lot of difficulties. And we've seen when we look at access to services that the responses and the solutions come from different levels. So we've heard of the national level solutions. So for example, the firewalls that were recommended to ensure that people who have precarious status can safely access services. Ireland was given as an example. Portugal was also one during the pandemic, but we know that city levels have also been responding. Concerning objective 5, regular pathways, we know that employers are quite keen on dialoguing in this issue, in this area, because of the need to ensure that they can actually supply their workforces properly. And concerning regular pathways, we should not overlook the role that regularization plays as a policy response. Some upcoming research will also affirm this. And research in this region in general in Europe has shown that regularization is definitely not taboo. When we look at now, just to end, going forward, we've heard a lot about multilateral cooperation. We've heard this, for example, concerning Objective 2, which looks at drivers, what is actually causing people to migrate. And there was a recommendation that in general states should be working together in partnership, and also there should be stronger links between the GCM and the Global Compact on Refugees, as well as the Paris Climate Agreement. Governments should address the climate crisis and people on the move. And we should also nudge governments to take bold steps, such as adopting the GCM if they haven't. A number of states in this broad region have not, and we should encourage them to do so. When we look at multi-stakeholder partnerships, we come back again to Objective 15 and access to services. We've heard of the whole trend now on digitalization, and civil societies are working with other partners to ensure migrants can have access to services, healthcare, etc., especially during the pandemic. We've also heard concerning Objective 20 about remittances and the Remittance Community Task Force, which is a very interesting example of more than 40 stakeholders who are working in the area of remittances. And finally, basically, it's been interesting to see that we haven't had as much input from stakeholders about how they've actually seen the national level implementation process. Have governments on the national level reached out to them? Have they actually given input in a formal or an informal way? So it's important that we look at this, but we've also heard throughout the meeting that there are various different ways for the GCM to be implemented. And part of this also means this meeting itself. It's been very important to have this meeting to hear from the different stakeholders. There have also been some suggestions and questions towards the end of our discussion on how, in general, we can actually improve implementation, but also inclusion. How can we make sure that migrants feel that they can really properly contribute to this process? How can we ensure that the whole of government approach is properly implemented, that we don't necessarily get stuck with the GCM in the Department of the Interior or the department that actually manages just migration, but that this discussion is actually across all administrations. And we've also heard that migration itself shouldn't be seen as technical. I say that as in the EU, we're now evaluating up to these 10 legislative proposals, which probably are more than 1,000 pages in technical details of how these new migration policies would work on the ground. It shouldn't be technical. It obviously has to be when governments develop all these policies, but at the heart of the day, it's about families. It's about people being able to be together. It's about family reunification policies not being too difficult for people to carry out on the ground. It's about children being able to be children without being seen first as migrants. And it's about workers who are contributing, who are doing and should be doing decent work and should be recognized for it. So I'd like to end there. Once again, not at all an exhaustive survey, but hopefully it can give some indication of some of the key areas in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please go ahead, Jonathan. Thank you very much, Michelle.
Thank you, Monami. Wow, it's impossible to come after Michelle. I second everything she said. She must have stolen my notes. That was really, sincerely, a fantastic summation. But because I have to say something, I will highlight just a few points from it. But I think, having listened to the day's deliberations and then having listened to Michelle's real-time distillation of it, There weren't any doubts before about the wisdom of having this sequencing of engagement, but now I think when we have the intergovernmental meeting on Thursday, and Michelle feeds these findings into that, then I think the value and richness of this discussion is going to be even clearer, many times more so. A few points that I would like to raise is I think that collective agreement that's been a thread throughout today's conversations about the need to continue to expand, whether it is geographically at sub-regional level or whether it is in terms of the different voices that we want to bring to deliberations on the GCM, the diversity of stakeholders engaged in this area. I think we've made progress to date, and it is gratifying to see, as we all believe, recognition that one of the GCM's achievements was to build into its DNA this commitment to a whole of society approach, but how we can nurture that and develop it in the period ahead is something that I think we'll all need to reflect on and to redouble our efforts in that regard. The second point I would like to make is that, I think there is a lot of positive proposals and practices that have come out of today's discussions and other discussions about peer learning, about creating dialogue spaces, building up the capacity of our partners to engage in the GCM. Concretizing these in the period ahead is going to be vital so that we don't all find ourselves in that position I suspect we have all found ourselves in on several times in the world in which we live, where we come back after a certain period of time and repeat the same very sensible recommendations. How we act on them, we would welcome your guidance and support. We would also welcome supporting you in these efforts. Which leads me to my third point. We've mentioned, several of us, I began my comments at the beginning of the day, noting that this was the first of the first. This was the first stakeholder engagement for the first regional review. I would hope that we can take the lessons that we have learned from this process, and indeed the ones we will learn from the meeting itself on Thursday and Friday, and help our partners and colleagues in other regions strengthen and improve their approaches to their respective regional reviews, that we make this a truly collaborative learning experience. And then my final point is the point I began today on, is that let's make this a dynamic process. We're all tired, it's the end of a busy year, but after this regional review, that shouldn't be the last word on migration dynamics, on GCM implementation at national, sub-regional, subnational levels until we get to the IMRF. How can we build on this effort, collective effort, this richness of material and insights to make sure that we continue these deliberations moving into 2021? That's it from me. Huge thanks to everyone who organized this in the Secretariat and in the broader network, and most importantly, amongst our stakeholder colleagues and friends. Keep well, keep safe, look forward to seeing you all virtually on Thursday and Friday. Many, many thanks. Bye-bye.